I had been planning that camping trip for weeks. I wanted a place far from people, far from noise, far from everything that felt like pressure. I picked a small valley in a forest area that wasn't very popular. I liked the idea of being alone with the trees and the cold air and the long, quiet night. I liked the idea of building a fire and listening to the sound of water running somewhere close by. I liked the idea of being away from everyone. I didn't think much about danger because I had camped many times before, and most of those trips felt calm and empty in a good way. I packed simple things. Just my tent, sleeping bag, a few tools, some dry food, my water bottles, my first aid kit, and a small knife I always carried when going outdoors. I didn't think I would need anything else because the weather looked good, and the forest looked like a quiet place. The road that led there was rough and narrow, and for a long time, the trees pressed close on both sides, making me feel like I was entering something deep and hidden. When I got close to the spot I had picked on the map, I parked my car off the dirt road and walked the rest of the way with my backpack on. The forest felt colder than I expected. The air smelled like wet soil, and the ground was full of old leaves that made soft crunching sounds under my boots. The place I had chosen looked even better in person. A small clearing with a flat patch of ground, tall trees surrounding me, and a thin stream of water running just far enough that I could hear it but not see it. The light came down through the branches in thin lines, and the wind made a slow sound that felt peaceful. I set up my tent slowly, making sure the ground was even. I wanted everything to feel comfortable because I planned to stay the night and leave in the morning. I had no signal on my phone, but I expected that. It was normal in areas like this. I wasn't worried about anyone bothering me because hardly anyone came this far. For the first few hours, everything felt calm. I collected dry sticks, started a small fire, boiled some water, and ate a simple meal. I watched the shadows grow longer as the sun moved behind the trees. The temperature dropped a little more. My breath became a thin mist when I exhaled. I put on a thicker jacket and sat closer to the fire. It was peaceful in a way that made me forget about time. But as the evening got darker, something slowly shifted. It started with an unusual feeling in my stomach, like my body sensed something before my mind did. It wasn't anything loud or obvious. It was just a small, sharp awareness that something around me wasn't the same as it had been earlier. I couldn't point to it, but I felt it. The wind sounded different. The forest felt heavier. The air seemed too still, like something was holding it in place. I tried to ignore the feeling at first. I tried to tell myself that being alone in the forest always made the mind create shapes out of shadows and sounds out of silence. But the more I tried to brush it off, the stronger it felt. It was like the forest wasn't just quiet anymore. It felt like it was listening. I added more wood to the fire and sat closer to the light. The darkness around the clearing grew thick. I watched the trees as if the bark and branches were watching me back. I felt my heartbeat in my ears. I kept trying to steady my breathing. Then I heard the first sound. It came from far in the trees, but it was sharp enough that it didn't blend with the natural sounds of the forest. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't wind breaking through branches or leaves rustling. It sounded like something metal lightly hitting something else. A thin, cold clink that didn't belong in a quiet forest. I froze. I didn't move at all. I just listened. After a few seconds, the sound came again, very faint but real. It was too controlled to be random. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to cut through the forest noise. I sat completely still and tried to guess what it could be, but the possibilities twisted in my mind. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe it was someone setting up equipment. Maybe it was someone who didn't want to be found. I didn't like any of those thoughts. I knew there were illegal hunters in some remote areas. People who came to hunt animals at night using traps or tools they shouldn't be using. People who didn't want witnesses. The thought sank into my chest like a cold weight. I put out my fire slowly. I didn't want the smoke or the light to draw attention. I pushed dirt over the flames and tried not to make noise. Once the fire was gone, the darkness swallowed me completely. The temperature dropped even more without the heat, but I didn't care. I stayed low and moved carefully toward my tent. I crouched by the entrance and listened again. At first, I heard nothing but the faint sound of water in the distance. But then something else came. This time it wasn't metal. It was the sound of heavy steps on dry leaves. Slow, cautious steps. Someone was walking in the forest. Someone with weight behind each footfall. I stayed very still. I kept my breath shallow. The steps came closer but stayed hidden by the trees. They didn't come straight toward my clearing. They moved at an angle, like whoever it was knew where they were going and didn't need a path. The sound of the steps wasn't clumsy or careless. They were steady, slow, and careful. I lay down flat on the ground beside my tent to stay out of sight. The cold earth pressed against my clothes, and I could feel my heartbeat pushing against the soil. My whole body felt tense. I knew the difference between a person walking and an animal walking. This was a person. After a long time, the steps faded away, but the silence that followed felt even worse. I didn't know where they had gone. I didn't know if they were close or far. The forest was too dark to see anything. I couldn't risk turning on a light or using my phone to check the time. I stayed on the ground for a long time, trying to listen for any signs of movement. The silence stretched until it felt painful. My arms felt stiff. My legs felt numb, but I didn't move. Then something happened that made my stomach tighten even more. I heard a different sound, the sound of something being dragged through the forest. Something heavy, the slow scrape of weight sliding over dirt and leaves. It sounded like someone pulling something long and solid, maybe wood, maybe metal, maybe something worse. It wasn't fast. It wasn't rushed. It was slow and controlled. I didn't know what they were dragging, but the sound was too steady to be anything good. As the dragging sound moved away, I finally let myself breathe a little deeper. My chest felt tight. My hands were shaking. For a moment, I thought about packing up and leaving immediately, but the thought of moving through the dark forest while someone else was out there with unknown intentions felt even more dangerous. If they heard me or saw my flashlight, anything could happen. It felt safer to stay hidden and wait until morning. I slowly crawled inside my tent, careful not to make noise. I didn't zip it up. I left it slightly open so I could hear everything outside. I lay down with my knife in my hand, not because I thought it would make a difference, but because holding something made me feel less helpless. The night felt endless. Every few minutes, I heard small sounds in the forest. Soft cracks, sudden rustles, faint shifting noises. It was impossible to tell which ones were animals and which ones were human. My mind paid attention to every single one. I could feel sweat on my back despite the cold. I could feel my heartbeat pressed against the ground. Hours passed without me sleeping at all. My body was tired, but my mind was too alert to let me drift off. The forest stayed dark and heavy, and my thoughts became slower and heavier with every passing minute. At some point deep in the night, when everything felt almost quiet enough to breathe normally again, I heard the worst sound of all. The sound of footsteps returning. This time they came from a different direction. They were slower, heavier, and closer than before. They came from the side of the clearing that I hadn't been facing. I lifted my head slightly and tried to look through the thin opening of my tent, but the darkness was too thick. The footsteps stopped very close to my tent. Too close, maybe only a few meters away. My throat felt dry. My hands tightened around the handle of the knife until my knuckles hurt. I couldn't see anything, but I knew someone was out there, standing, listening, watching. The person stood there for a long time. I could tell by the way the forest stayed silent except for the faint sound of breathing that wasn't mine. Slow, controlled breathing. Someone trying to stay quiet but not able to hide it completely. I didn't move a muscle. I kept my face close to the ground. I tried to slow my breathing so it wouldn't be heard. My mind was racing, but my body felt frozen. After a long minute, the person shifted their weight slightly, causing a soft sound of dirt moving under a boot. Then they took one step back, then another. Then the footsteps moved away again, slow and deliberate. They didn't run. They didn't rush. They walked away like they had seen enough. I didn't move until the footsteps were completely gone. Even then, I didn't trust the silence. I stayed curled in the tent, barely breathing, waiting for any sign that they had come back. The forest stayed dark and still. Time felt twisted and slow. When the sky finally started to lighten, I opened my tent carefully and looked around. There were footprints in the clearing. Deep footprints from a heavy man wearing boots. They came from the trees, stopped close to my tent, turned, and left toward the opposite side of the forest. I followed the footprints with my eyes but didn't go after them. I didn't want to know where they led. I didn't want to see anything else the person had been doing in the forest. I broke down my tent as fast as I could, stuffed everything into my backpack without caring about organization, and rushed toward the dirt road. The forest felt different in the daylight. Still cold, still heavy, but less suffocating. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching me, but I didn't see anyone. When I reached my car, I threw my gear inside and drove as fast as the rough road allowed. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road miles away. I didn't report anything because I didn't know what I would even say. I didn't see a face. I didn't see a weapon. I didn't see the thing being dragged. I only knew I had camped near someone who didn't want to be found. Someone who moved at night with tools and heavy objects. Someone who stood close to my tent and listened to my breathing. The ending stays with me to this day. I learned that being alone in the forest is not always peaceful. Sometimes you walk into a place where someone else already is, someone who isn't camping, someone who is doing something they don't want anyone else to see. I learned that silence can hide things that you don't expect. And I learned that the forest is not dangerous because of animals or ghosts or anything supernatural. It's dangerous because people can be out there doing things in the dark. That night taught me something clear. I wasn't alone out there, and I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that person. I left without being seen in daylight, and that was the only reason nothing worse happened. If I had made noise, if I had kept the fire burning, if I had gone to investigate the sounds, or if I had moved around the forest when those footsteps came, the ending could have been very different. I survived that night only because I stayed still, and I never camped alone again. I always liked camping alone because it made me feel like the world slowed down. When I planned this trip, I picked a quiet forest area far from towns and people. I wanted silence. I wanted open space. I wanted time away from everything. I had no idea how different silence feels when you start noticing every sound inside it. I had no idea how heavy it becomes when you realize something is repeating itself not by accident, but because someone else is there with you. I arrived in the late afternoon. The forest was calm, washed in soft orange light from the sun dropping behind the tall trees. The air smelled like dry leaves and warm pine. I parked my car at the end of a long dirt road that barely looked used. There were no other cars, no other signs of campers. Just an empty stretch of road ending at a clearing where the trees opened wide enough for one tent and a small fire pit I could build myself. I always felt safest when I could see everything around me. The clearing was perfect for that. I could see the tree line from every angle. There were no sharp corners, no fallen logs blocking my view, nothing that forced me to guess what was hidden behind it. It felt peaceful enough that I took my time setting everything up. I unpacked the tent, the sleeping bag, the food, the water, the small folding chair, everything I needed. I moved slowly, enjoying the rhythm of each little task. Hours passed easily. Soon the sun was low enough that the shadows stretched long across the ground. I could hear the typical forest sounds: wind moving through branches, small animals brushing against dry leaves, the occasional distant bird. All normal, all familiar, nothing strange. When I finished setting up my camp, I built a small fire. I didn't make it too big because I didn't want sparks reaching the trees. I cooked some simple food on it and sat down to eat while the sky shifted from gold to dark blue. The first stars appeared. The air cooled down. Everything around me looked almost peaceful enough to sleep right away. But then I noticed something I couldn't explain at first. A single sound, like a branch snapping. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even close. But it was too clear to ignore. I told myself it was probably an animal. Forests are full of them. I had heard animals before, but this sound didn't fade away afterward. It didn't follow the normal pattern animals make when they move through leaves. Came once, then nothing else. I listened for a while. My mind kept going back to it even after the silence returned. It bothered me enough that I looked around the clearing, staring deeper into the forest. The tree line was already dark, and I couldn't see past the first few feet. Everything looked still. I didn't see any shape or movement. Eventually, I convinced myself it wasn't important. I cleaned up the food and put everything inside a sealed container so that animals wouldn't come close. I sat by the fire a little longer and watched the flames rise and fall until they finally grew small enough that I let them fade out completely. When I went inside the tent, the forest felt quiet again. Too quiet. I noticed it when I lay down and pulled the sleeping bag over my body. Usually, even at night, I could still hear animals or the wind. But that moment had a stillness that felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to sleep. I rolled over several times. My back hurt a little from the hard ground. My mind kept replaying the branch snapping. It had been far away, but the sharpness of it felt wrong. I finally fell asleep sometime later. I woke up sometime around midnight. At least that's what it felt like from how cold the air was. I wasn't sure what woke me at first, but then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful, very deliberate. They were on the dry leaves somewhere near the trees. They weren't constant. I would hear 2 or 3 steps, then silence, then another 2 or 3. They weren't heavy like a large animal. They weren't fast like something running. They were spaced out, cautious, almost measured. I froze inside the sleeping bag. My heartbeat grew loud enough that I could feel it pulsing in my throat. I stayed still because the more I listened, the more I realized this was not an animal. Animals don't take steps like that. They don't walk like someone who doesn't want to be noticed. These steps had weight and intention. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe too loudly. I listened for what felt like a long time, trying to figure out if whoever was out there was moving toward the tent or just passing by. It was impossible to tell because the steps stopped too often. Every time they went quiet, I felt a tension gather in my chest, like waiting for something to reappear. Eventually, they stopped completely. I didn't know if that meant the person left or if they were standing still somewhere just outside the clearing. I stayed awake for hours, watching the faint shape of the tent wall in the darkness and listening to every small sound. Sometimes I thought I heard movement. Sometimes I thought I imagined it. But I never heard footsteps again. Not that night. When morning came, I felt stiff and exhausted. The sunlight felt too bright when I stepped outside the tent. The forest was peaceful again, but I could still feel something wrong pressing against the back of my thoughts. I looked around the clearing slowly. I checked the dirt near the edge of the trees. There were marks in the ground. Shallow, narrow, strangely spaced like someone had walked there. But nothing looked very clear because dry leaves had been moved around. I tried to calm myself by doing normal tasks. I made a small fire for breakfast. I walked around the clearing. I checked my car. Everything looked untouched. I told myself I had probably overreacted. People sometimes hike at night. Maybe someone passed through. Maybe they didn't even notice my tent. I forced myself to believe that explanation because the alternative felt too disturbing. I planned to hike a bit that day. I followed a narrow dirt trail that started behind the trees. It went deeper into the forest and toward a small stream I noticed on a map before coming. The air felt fresh. The forest looked open and peaceful. It helped distract my mind for a while. But after an hour of walking, I started noticing something unusual. I saw footprints on the trail. They weren't mine. They were deeper, larger, made by someone wearing boots. They weren't old either. They looked like they were made recently, maybe earlier that morning. At first, I thought they belonged to another camper or hiker. But then I realized something that made my stomach tighten. The footprints always stayed ahead of me on the trail. They were never coming from the other direction. They were always going the same direction I was going. But I had started hiking very early, shortly after sunrise, and I had not seen anyone. It meant someone had walked that trail earlier than me, probably not long before I did. Someone who might have been the same person I heard during the night. Someone who could easily step off the trail at any moment. I kept walking because I didn't want to panic. The air was cool and quiet. The trees swayed slightly from the breeze. The path looked normal except for those footprints that kept appearing ahead. When I reached the stream, I stayed there for a while, sitting on a rock and listening to the water run. It helped a bit, but the thought didn't leave my mind. It stayed with me like something stuck under the skin. I went back the same way. The footprints were still there. The forest felt heavier now, like the silence had a weight. The sunlight didn't feel warm anymore. Every shadow looked deeper and every rustle felt like a warning. When I reached my camp again, I checked around the clearing more carefully. I noticed that the leaves near the trees looked disturbed in more places than before, like more footsteps had passed through. But I couldn't tell if it happened during the night or morning. I spent the rest of the day trying to act normal. I cooked some food. I walked around the clearing. I checked the map again. I cleaned up the small fire pit. But beneath it all, my mind kept circling the same fear. Someone had been near my tent at night. Someone had walked ahead of me on the trail. Someone might be somewhere in the trees watching me even when I didn't see anything. The sun started to lower again. The shadows grew longer. The noise of birds and insects began to fade as evening settled in. I felt dread gather in my chest as the light dimmed. I didn't want night to come. I didn't want darkness to fill the clearing. But I had nowhere else to go because the nearest town was far away and the dirt road wasn't safe to drive at night. As the sky turned dark, I sat close to the fire and watched it carefully. I listened to the forest. Every small sound made my muscles tense. When the fire burned low, I added more wood. I kept it alive longer than usual because I didn't want to crawl into the tent too early. But eventually the fire faded, and I knew I couldn't keep it going forever. When I got into the tent, the fear that had been building through the day felt stronger than the night before. I lay in the sleeping bag without closing my eyes, listening to the forest breathe around me. At first it was quiet. No footsteps, no noise, just silence. But then, slowly, something changed. I heard movement, soft at first, a rustle of leaves, then more rustling, then a slow shift of weight on the ground, like someone carefully stepping closer. The pattern was almost identical to the night before. Slow, cautious, intentional. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. I kept still, staring at the faint outline of the tent roof above me. The steps came closer. Then they paused. Then they came closer again. The leaves crunched very softly under the person's weight. They were at the tree line. Then they were closer. I could feel the presence before I could hear anything else. I sensed them somewhere near the tent, maybe a few feet away, maybe right outside the thin fabric wall. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I kept my breathing slow and silent. The steps circled around the tent. Very slow, very careful. I felt the air inside the tent grow heavier, like someone was breathing close to the fabric from outside. There was no sound except that. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. A faint shadow moved across the fabric. A tall shape, someone standing still, watching, listening. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The shadow didn't move. I didn't move either. My entire body felt frozen. Then, slowly, the shadow shifted. The footsteps returned, quiet, spaced out, moving away from the tent, back into the trees. And then silence again. I stayed awake the rest of the night without sleeping at all. When morning finally came, I stepped outside trembling. The forest looked calm again, but I could see clear marks in the dirt near the tent. Footprints. A man's boots. They circled around the tent multiple times. They stopped near the entrance. They went back toward the trees. Someone had been watching me all night. I felt a deep instinct telling me not to stay another night. I packed everything fast. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't rest. I didn't look around too long because I didn't want to see something I couldn't unsee. I moved with urgency, stuffing the sleeping bag, breaking down the tent, throwing everything into the car without caring about order. But the fear didn't go away. It got worse because I felt watched again. I felt eyes on me from somewhere in the trees even though I couldn't see anyone. I kept looking over my shoulder while packing, but the forest stayed still. No movement, no sound. When I finally got into the car, I locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The dirt road was narrow and rough, but I drove faster than I should have. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see someone step out from the trees. The entire time I felt like something was following me. Something human, something patient. When I reached the main road, the fear didn't fade. I kept driving for a long time until I reached the next town. I stopped at a gas station and sat inside the car trying to breathe normally again. My clothes smelled like smoke and dirt. My skin felt cold even under the sun. I looked at the edges of the parking lot, the road, the passing cars. Everything looked normal. No boots, no man, no forest. Just open public space where people walked freely. But inside me the feeling didn't leave. The knowledge stayed heavy in my chest. Someone was watching me at that campsite. Someone got close to my tent. Someone listened to my breathing in the dark. Someone walked ahead of me on the trail early in the morning. Someone circled me from the trees without ever showing their face. Someone quietly stalked me for 2 days in a wide open forest where no one else was around. And the worst part of the ending, the part that still lives in my mind, is that I never saw him even once. I never knew what he wanted. I never knew if he planned to wait another night. I never knew if leaving early saved me from something that was supposed to happen if I stayed. But I do know one thing very clearly. Someone was out there with me the entire time. Someone who moved slowly, waited patiently, walked alone in the night, and came close enough to touch the thin wall of my tent while I was trapped inside. Someone who stayed just far enough away to never be seen, but close enough to hear every sound I made in the dark. And there is nothing more realistic or terrifying than knowing that a real man, someone silent, patient, and hidden, was right there with me in the forest, watching me sleep, following me through the trees, and waiting for something I never allowed to happen because I packed up and escaped before he made his move. I never camped alone again. I drove out to the mountains late in the afternoon because I needed a break from the noise of the city. I had been working long hours for weeks, barely sleeping, barely eating properly, and I felt like my mind was getting heavier every day. I wanted a place where I could breathe normally and hear nothing but wind. The mountains were quiet this time of year, and I liked that. I packed my tent, my sleeping bag, enough food for 2 days, a flashlight, a knife, and a first aid kit. I wanted a simple trip. Just me and the trees. It was early evening when I reached the dirt road that led to the old camping area. The sun was still up, but it was sinking behind the tall pines, throwing long shadows across the ground. The road was rough and full of small stones that popped under my tires. Dust covered my windshield as I drove deeper into the woods. I could feel the air getting colder with every turn. The smell of pine needles grew stronger, and the forest became thicker. I eventually reached the clearing where I had camped once before. It was empty, exactly how I hoped it would be. The clearing was wide and flat, surrounded by trees on all sides except for a rocky slope on the east side. A small stream ran about 50 meters away, hidden behind fallen logs and thick brush. The ground was soft and covered with dry needles. I liked this spot because it was open enough to see around me but still deep inside the forest. I parked my car near a big stump and took my gear out. The air felt calm, like the whole world had slowed down, and I felt some peace for the first time in weeks. I set up my tent facing the tree-line. I hammered the stakes down and tightened the ropes. The fabric made a soft snapping sound in the wind. Once the tent was done, I set up my small cooking stove on a flat rock and boiled water for a simple meal. As the water heated, I stood there listening to the forest sounds. I could hear the stream faintly, the rustling of leaves, and the distant call of a bird. Nothing unusual. Everything felt normal. I ate slowly, trying to soak in the quiet, but as the sun dropped lower and the light began to fade, the cold crept in faster. I put on an extra layer and walked around the clearing a little to stretch my legs. The forest floor crackled under my boots. I noticed a few old footprints in the dirt near the tree-line, but they were too faded to tell much. They looked like they were from hiking boots, but I wasn't sure. It wasn't strange, since hikers often passed through this area months earlier. I didn't think anything of it. When night came, the temperature dropped hard. The forest became darker than I expected. The moon was hidden behind clouds, so there wasn't much natural light. I turned on my flashlight and kept it with me while I organized my gear. The beam cut through the darkness but didn't feel like enough. The trees looked thicker and closer in the dark. Everything looked different when the sun was gone. I climbed into my tent after brushing my teeth and putting away my food in the car so animals wouldn't try to get into it. The tent felt warm once I zipped it shut. I lay down in my sleeping bag, letting my body relax. The sounds of the forest felt gentle at first, like a steady rhythm. Insects buzzed softly. The wind moved through the branches above me. I could hear the faint trickle of the stream. I tried to let my mind drift, but my body still felt restless from stress and exhaustion. I must have dozed off because I didn't remember the moment I fell asleep. But I woke up sometime in the middle of the night because I heard something moving outside. It wasn't loud. It was a slow, steady crushing sound, like someone stepping on dry needles and small sticks. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. Animals often passed through the clearing, but the steps sounded spaced apart, like something heavy. Not heavy enough to be a bear, but heavier than a small animal. I stayed still inside my sleeping bag, listening. The sound seemed to move near the edge of my campsite, near the cooking stove. I could hear something brushing against the rock. My heart slowed and then sped up in sharp pulses. I waited for the sound to fade, but it didn't. Stayed for a moment, then moved again. A few slow steps. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on yet. The air inside the tent felt tight and warm, like I was holding my breath without realizing it. Eventually, the steps faded into the forest. I waited longer, trying to decide whether I should look outside, but I didn't want to startle an animal. After several minutes of stillness, I forced myself to relax again and tried to sleep. It took a long time before my mind settled. When morning came, the sun was bright, and the cold had lifted a little. I stepped out of my tent and stretched. The sunlight made everything look harmless again. The forest was quiet except for some birds hopping around the trees. I walked over to the cooking stove and noticed marks in the dirt that weren't there the day before. They looked like footprints. Actual footprints. Fresh ones. I crouched down and stared at them. They were shaped like boot prints, not animal tracks. They looked like someone had walked very slowly near my stove and then moved toward the trees. I felt a strange tension in my stomach. Someone had walked into my campsite without making a sound except for those slow steps. Someone had been there in the dark while I slept. I looked around the clearing, scanning the tree line, but everything looked still. I told myself maybe it was an old hiker who got lost or walked through my area to find the stream. I tried not to overthink it. The forest was big, and people sometimes wandered off the trail. I cooked breakfast and ate slowly, trying to push the uneasiness down. After cleaning up, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I followed a narrow path that led deeper into the woods. The forest felt peaceful in daylight. The sun cut through the trees in thin beams. I walked for a long time, going uphill and downhill, stopping occasionally to look at odd-shaped rocks or fallen logs covered in moss. My mind settled again, and I felt more relaxed. But then, about a kilometer from my campsite, I found something I hadn't expected. I reached a part of the path where the trees opened slightly, and in the soft dirt, there were more footprints. They were fresh and deep, like someone had walked here recently. The footprints moved off the trail and disappeared into thick brush. I crouched down and looked at them closely. They looked like the same boots that had made the prints in my campsite. Then I noticed something else. A torn piece of fabric was stuck on a bramble bush. Dark green, like it came from a jacket. The edges were frayed and ripped. It hung there, unmoving in the still air. I picked it up and turned it in my hand. Felt worn. For a moment I thought someone might be hurt or lost. The forest was confusing for someone without a map or a good sense of direction. I kept walking, pushing through the brush a little, but the ground became uneven and harder to follow. After a few minutes, I turned back. I didn't want to get lost myself. The forest could twist around a person quickly. I returned to my campsite with the fabric in my pocket, still unsure of what to make of it. The rest of the day was quiet. I cooked again, rested, wrote a little in a small notebook, and watched the trees sway. But the thought of those footprints stayed with me. Someone had walked close to my tent in the middle of the night. Someone had been wandering near my campsite and deeper into the woods. Someone who had torn clothing. The idea scratched at the back of my mind, no matter how much I tried to ignore it. When night came again, the cold returned even stronger than before. I added more layers and sat outside for a bit before going into my tent. The sky was clearer that night, and the moonlight made the clearing look almost silver. The shadows were long and sharp. I sat on the log near my fire pit, listening. Nothing moved. The forest felt frozen. After a while, I went into my tent and got into my sleeping bag. I kept my flashlight in my hand this time. I felt uneasy, like something was different tonight. I tried to sleep, but my ears stayed awake even when my eyes closed. After maybe an hour, maybe two, I heard it again. The same slow steps, but this time they came from a different direction. They were near the rocky slope on the east side of the clearing. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. The steps were careful, controlled, almost as if whoever was walking was trying not to make noise. The steps moved across the clearing, closer to my tent. I gripped my flashlight tighter. The fabric of the tent felt thin around me. I could hear my own breathing now, uneven and short. The steps stopped a few meters from me. I waited. The forest felt dead silent. Even the wind had stopped. Then I heard something new. A slow scraping sound, like someone dragging something across the ground. It lasted only a second, then stopped. My stomach tightened. I didn't know if it was an object, a bag, or something else being moved. I didn't move inside the tent. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. Minutes passed. I counted them in my head. The steps eventually moved again, slowly circling the campsite. Then they faded into the trees, swallowed by the darkness. I lay there stiff and sweating in the cold. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning finally arrived, the sun felt weak, like it wasn't able to warm anything. I stepped out of my tent and immediately saw the ground. The footprints were clearer this time. They circled the tent. Some were closer than before. Someone had been standing less than 2 meters from where I slept. I felt exposed, like I had been watched. My hands shook as I checked around the clearing. Near the rocky slope, I found another strange thing. A small metal canteen half buried under leaves. It looked scratched and old. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't mine. Picked it up and smelled it. It had the faint scent of stale water. Someone had either dropped it or left it behind. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just a lost hiker wandering randomly. Someone was moving around my campsite during the night. Someone who never spoke up, never asked for help, never made their presence clear. Someone who approached silently and left objects behind or dragged them around. Someone who possibly had been watching me since I arrived. I felt a wave of unease spread through me. You don't ignore things like this in the forest. Strange behavior from a stranger meant danger. Anyone who needed help would have shouted or come close during the day. But this person waited until nighttime to walk around me. That was not the behavior of someone sane or safe. I decided to pack up and leave immediately, but something happened before I could. I'll continue in the next message because the system will cut it if I try to send it all at once. Let me know and I'll send part 2 instantly, continuing the story in one long piece. I went on that camping trip because I wanted to clear my head. I had been living in the city for too long, surrounded by noise, traffic, tight schedules, and stress that sat on me like a heavy blanket. I felt like I had forgotten how it felt to breathe in clean air or hear silence that wasn't filled with car horns or people arguing or sirens passing every hour. I just wanted one weekend with nothing around me except trees, dirt, cold air, and maybe the sound of water from a river if I was lucky. That was why I chose a far, isolated forest area that most people avoided. I liked quiet places, and the online map showed a small section of forest that was still open to visitors but rarely used. It seemed perfect for what I wanted. I reached the forest late in the afternoon after driving for several hours on long, empty highways. As soon as I turned off the main road, the forest swallowed the light. The tall trees stood so close to each other that the branches formed a dark ceiling above the narrow dirt road. It made the sunlight fade even though the sky was still bright. I kept driving deeper until the trees looked like thick walls pressing on both sides of the road. There were no signs of people anywhere. No other cars. No footsteps. No tire marks. Nothing. It felt like I had stepped into a place that had been untouched for months. I found a small clearing next to a slow river, just like I hoped for. The water moved lazily, making soft sounds that blended with the wind. The clearing was flat enough for my tent, and there were no big dead trees leaning over it that could fall during the night. The ground had patches of soft grass mixed with dirt. Everything seemed calm. I felt like this place would finally let me relax. I unpacked slowly, taking my time with each movement. I liked the feeling of settling into nature. I set up my tent, checked that the stakes were deep in the ground, placed my sleeping bag inside, and organized my things in a neat layout so I could find everything easily. I placed my lighter, knife, flashlight, spare batteries, and food supplies in one corner. I kept my water bottles within reach. I even spread out a tarp under the tent to keep moisture out. Everything felt routine until I noticed something strange. I spotted faint footprints near the riverbank. At first, I assumed they were mine from earlier, but they were much larger than my own, and the pattern didn't match my shoes. They looked old, maybe a couple of days old, but it was strange because the area was supposed to be used most of the time. I pushed the thought away and told myself that hikers must pass through here sometimes. It wasn't impossible. The forest was big. I didn't want to start the trip with some unnecessary fear. The air grew colder as the sun sank behind the trees. I gathered dry branches and small sticks to make a fire before darkness took over. I always liked how fire kept me warm and made me feel like I had a barrier between myself and the rest of the world. As night settled in, the forest grew darker than anything I had seen before. No street lights, no house lights, nothing artificial. Only the flickering glow from my small fire. I ate a simple meal, just heated some canned food, and sat on a log near the fire. I listened to the river, the crackling of the wood, and the distant sounds of insects. Eventually, the long drive made my eyes heavy. I decided to turn in for the night. I made sure my backpack was inside the tent with me so nothing would wander off with it. I left the dying fire outside and zipped up the tent. The cold night air settled around me, and I crawled into my sleeping bag. I fell asleep faster than I expected, but sometime deep into the night, I woke up. It wasn't sudden like a jump. It was slow, like my mind drifted upward from sleep because something didn't feel right. I opened my eyes without moving my body. The inside of my tent was pitch dark. I couldn't see my own hands. The forest outside was quiet, so quiet that it didn't seem natural. That was the first thing that bothered me. Forests at night always have some noise. Insects, wind, water, something. But this silence was too thick, too heavy. Then I heard something. It was soft at first. Faint crunch. A slow shift of weight on dry leaves. It came from outside my tent, not far from where my feet were. My heart began beating faster. I held my breath so I wouldn't make any sound. More footsteps followed. They weren't the fast, light steps of an animal. They were slow, careful, and heavy, like someone was trying not to be heard. The steps moved around my tent in a half circle. The person, because it sounded like a person, was staying close but not touching anything. I remained still, afraid to even breathe too loudly. The footsteps paused near the entrance of my tent. My fire had died out long ago, so if someone was standing there, they could see everything outside while I saw nothing inside. I felt exposed even though I was hidden by the thin fabric of the tent. I waited for minutes that felt like hours. My muscles were tight from fear. I kept trying to convince myself that maybe it was a hiker or someone passing through the woods at night, but nobody walks through forests in complete darkness unless they have a reason. Then the footsteps moved again, slowly fading toward the trees. I waited a long time after that, maybe an hour or more, before I relaxed enough to breathe normally again. I didn't sleep after that. I stared at the roof of the tent in the darkness until the sky outside finally began to lighten. When morning came, I unzipped the tent cautiously and stepped out. The cold air hit my face, but I barely felt it. I looked around the clearing, and right away I saw the footprints in the soft dirt. They were fresh, deep, large. They circled my tent exactly where I heard the sounds. The person had moved around me, stopped near my entrance, then walked back toward the forest on the opposite side of the river. I followed the tracks for a short distance but stopped when they disappeared into thick undergrowth. Whoever it was knew where they were going. They had moved through the area quietly and had no reason to be there unless they were watching my camp. I tried to shake off the fear and tell myself it was just someone passing by, but deep inside I knew it wasn't normal. Most hikers would make noise, carry lights, or check in if they saw someone camping alone. This person had stayed silent the entire time. I didn't want to pack up and leave right away. I had driven too far and I wanted at least one full day of peace. I thought maybe the person would never return, so I tried to carry on with my plans. I boiled water, ate a simple breakfast, and took a walk near the river. But the forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. Every time a branch snapped or a bird flew out of a tree, my body tensed up. I felt like eyes were watching me from somewhere I couldn't see. I tried to enjoy the daylight hours by exploring the area, walking along the river, and sitting by the water. But I kept glancing back at the tree line without meaning to. It was like my mind couldn't accept the idea of being alone anymore. I kept looking for movement behind the trees, expecting to see someone standing there. By the time the sun began to drop again, my anxiety started to climb steadily. I didn't want the night to come. The memory of those footsteps circled around in my head. But leaving at that moment would mean driving through narrow forest roads in fading light, and that didn't seem safe either. I told myself I would handle one more night, but I would take precautions. I built my fire earlier than before. I gathered more wood to keep the flames bright longer. I kept my flashlight right next to me and even placed a heavy branch close enough to reach if I needed something to defend myself. The forest still felt too quiet, like everything inside it was holding its breath. When it got dark, I sat close to the fire with my back against a large fallen log so nobody could approach from behind without making noise. I tried to relax by focusing on the firelight, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Hours passed, and nothing seemed to move around me except the river. At some point around midnight, I heard something again. It was faint, far away at first, but clearly footsteps. Slow, rhythmic, careful. They came from the same direction as the previous night, from deep inside the trees. My chest tightened with fear. The footsteps grew clearer, coming closer to the clearing. The darkness beyond the firelight felt like a solid wall with something moving behind it. I didn't move. I stared into the shadows where the firelight faded. The footsteps stopped again, just out of sight. I could tell the person was standing there, watching. The fire crackled and popped, but everything else was still. I felt the strongest urge to run, but running in the dark would only get me lost or hurt. I sat frozen, gripping the heavy branch with both hands. I kept my eyes on the darkness until tears formed from not blinking. Then the sound changed. I heard breathing, not fast or loud, but steady. Someone was close enough that their breathing carried through the trees. I knew at that moment that this wasn't an accident. The person had come back on purpose. My fear pushed me to make a decision. I threw a handful of thick branches into the fire to make the flames flare brighter. The sudden burst of light spread deeper into the clearing and lit up the edges of the trees. For a split second, I saw a shape, a tall figure standing behind a tree trunk. The person moved back quickly, trying to stay hidden, but I caught enough of the outline to know it wasn't my imagination. I felt a cold wave run through my body. I didn't sleep that night at all. I stayed beside the fire until morning. The figure didn't step out again, but I heard movement several times. Every sound made my heart jump. When the sun finally rose, I made up my mind to leave immediately. I couldn't spend another night here. I packed everything fast, barely caring about neatness. I kept glancing toward the forest constantly. My hands shook so much that I dropped things more than once. I loaded my car and took one last look around the clearing. The feeling of being watched was so strong that it made my skin crawl. I got inside the vehicle and started the engine as fast as I could. The narrow dirt road felt even more suffocating on the way out. The trees seemed to lean closer, blocking out the light. Every bend made me think someone might step out in front of me. Halfway down the road, I saw something that made my stomach twist. On the right side of the road, pressed into the dirt, were fresh footprints, the same kind I saw near my tent. They were heading in the direction of my campsite. Someone had been walking toward me early that morning, maybe while I was packing, maybe even while I was still in the clearing. I knew then that leaving was the only smart choice. The deeper I drove out of the forest, the more the sunlight returned, and the trees began to thin. The feeling of being watched slowly faded, but not completely. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting someone to appear behind me. When I finally reached the highway, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in 2 days. I didn't stop driving until I was far away from the forest. Even then, the fear stayed with me like a heavy weight. In the days that followed, I tried to move on, but every night I found myself thinking about those footsteps circling my tent, the figure hiding in the trees, and the fresh footprints by the road. I knew that whoever was in that forest had been watching me the whole time, waiting, moving closer each night without saying a single word. They didn't try to steal anything. They didn't try to scare me with noise. They just watched, silent, patient, hidden in the darkness. I realized something that made the fear settle deeper inside me. If I hadn't woken up that first night, or if I hadn't kept the fire bright the second night, or if I had fallen asleep too early, that person might have walked right up to my tent. Maybe they did the night before and I just didn't notice. Maybe they were waiting for the moment when I would let my guard down. Asterisk asterisk. I never went back to that forest. I never camped alone again. And sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I still remember the sound of slow footsteps circling me in the darkness, and I realize how close I came to being completely helpless in a place where nobody would have found me. That camping trip taught me one thing very clearly. The scariest thing in the wilderness isn't the animals, or the darkness, or the cold. It's the people who know how to move silently in a place where nobody can hear you scream, and who choose to watch instead of speak. Asterisk asterisk. And the worst part is knowing that somewhere out there, in that thick forest, that person is probably still wandering, waiting for the next camper who thinks they're alone. I decided to go camping alone in early autumn, during the time when the air has that cold edge but the days still hold enough warmth to make long walks comfortable. I wanted a break from everything around me. I wanted silence that wasn't broken by traffic or people or phones or anything else. I wanted to hear only wind, trees, and the sound of my own breathing. I picked a forest area far from the paved roads, the kind of place where you don't accidentally run into anyone unless they plan just as carefully as you did. I felt proud of myself as I drove there. I had food packed, a new tent, extra clothes, and enough water to last several days. I wanted the feeling of isolation. I wanted that heavy quiet that only deep woods seem to have. The hike from the small dirt parking spot to the place I chose took more than 2 hours. The trail slowly turned into a narrow path, and the path faded until it became just ground with scattered leaves and dry branches. Every 10 or 15 minutes, I stopped to listen. It wasn't fear. It was just the simple habit of being out in nature. I liked the idea that anything could be nearby, but nothing had reason to bother me as long as I minded my own space. I reached a clearing that wasn't marked on any basic maps. It was a gentle depression in the land, almost like a bowl. Trees formed a high ring around it. There was soft ground in the center. A fallen tree lay on its side along the far edge. It looked like a place someone may have camped long ago, but there was no sign of fresh use. No trash, no footprints, no disturbed ground. Just a calm, forgotten place. I felt lucky finding it. I set up my tent near the fallen tree because it gave me a natural barrier on one side. I liked having something behind me when I slept. It made me feel protected, even though the tent itself meant nothing against anything large enough to push through the thin fabric. Still, it made me feel like I had a wall. I prepared the inside with my sleeping pad and bag, put all food in airtight containers, and kept everything neat so I wouldn't attract animals. I sat on the ground afterward and looked up at the sky. The sun was dropping behind the trees, making everything gold, then orange. The air felt colder as soon as light began fading. I felt that deep forest quiet that stretches across everything. That first night, nothing unusual happened. I sat outside long enough to watch the stars start coming out. I ate a simple meal, put away everything, and climbed into the tent. Laying down, I listened to the distant sounds of the woods, light cracking noises, soft movement of branches, the occasional bird calling as it settled for the night. It all felt normal, felt peaceful. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up with my heart beating fast for no reason I could identify. There was no sound that pulled me from sleep, at least none that I could remember. The tent was cold. My breath made a faint fog in the air. I lay completely still, listening. The forest outside was so silent it felt unnatural, but at the same time, I thought maybe I was imagining the unusual feeling because I had woken up abruptly. I stayed still for a long time until my body calmed, then eventually drifted back to sleep. That morning I stepped out of the tent and saw nothing strange. I walked around the clearing for a while. The ground looked undisturbed. The trees around me looked normal. I made breakfast, cleaned up, and then took a long walk deeper into the woods. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and every few steps I felt the crunch under my boots. The sun filtered through the tall trees, and in some moments, when the breeze moved the branches, the light shimmered like water. It was calm, easy, and empty. I walked for hours and returned to camp in the early afternoon. That was when I noticed something small, something that didn't seem important at first. Near the base of the fallen tree, right next to the spot where I had set up, there was a disturbed patch of leaves, like someone had brushed aside the top layer and looked underneath. I stared at it for a while, trying to remember if I had done that myself the previous day. I thought maybe I had stepped there without realizing it. The ground didn't show any clear footprints because the leaves were too thick, but something about the area looked slightly wrong. I shrugged it off. I was alone in the woods, and I didn't want to create fear for myself when nothing had truly happened. The rest of the day was normal. I collected water from a stream a short distance away, cleaned my gear. I reorganized things so the tent wouldn't get messy. I ate dinner early because the night came faster under the trees. When the dark fully settled, I climbed into my tent and tried to sleep. That night was different. I woke up again, hours after falling asleep. This time I knew why. There was a faint crunch outside the tent. A slow, careful step, then another, then nothing. My chest tightened. I didn't move, not even a finger. I listened so hard that the blood rushing in my ears made its own sound. The footsteps didn't continue. Whoever, or whatever, was outside had either stopped or moved quietly. The silence pressed in so strongly that I felt like I was holding my breath even when I wasn't. I waited a long time. After at least 10 minutes, when nothing else happened, I forced myself to breathe normally and eventually drifted off, though it was a restless, shallow sleep. When I stepped out of the tent the next morning, I looked around carefully. The ground looked normal at first, but when I walked around the tent slowly, I noticed a detail that froze me. On the side opposite the fallen tree, the leaves had been disturbed again, but in a slight arc pattern near the tent wall. Not scraped from the wind, not pushed aside by an animal. It looked like someone had stood there, directly beside my tent. At some point in the night, possibly for a while, my mouth felt dry and my stomach felt heavy, almost painful. I circled the area again and again, looking for anything else. A footprint, a dropped item, an indent in the ground, but there was nothing clear. Whoever had been there had moved lightly or simply didn't care about leaving evidence. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but something stubborn inside me didn't want to. I had driven far, hiked far, and prepared for this trip. I didn't want to lose the experience over something that might have been a deer or something else harmless. But deep down I knew those weren't deer steps. A deer wouldn't stand still like that. A deer wouldn't brush leaves aside the way I kept finding them. Still, I stayed. I spent the day exploring closer to camp. The more I walked in the area around my clearing, the more I noticed subtle things I had missed earlier. There were several small spots where the ground had been disturbed, like someone had knelt or sat. On a thick tree trunk about waist height, there was a faint mark that looked like something had rubbed against it repeatedly. Not enough to carve the bark, but enough to make a smooth patch. When I looked closer, I noticed strands of fiber stuck in the edge. They looked like the frayed ends of a shirt or jacket. They were dull green, very similar to outdoor clothing you might see on hikers or hunters. The strands blended into the tree color so well I wondered how long they had been there. They didn't look fresh, but they also didn't look old. The uneasy feeling in my chest grew heavier. By late afternoon, I couldn't shake the sense that someone else was living somewhere close in the forest. Someone who stayed out of sight. Someone who moved quietly. Someone who didn't want to be found. I tried to calm myself by gathering more water and preparing food again. I organized everything more carefully this time, putting things in specific spots so I would know if anything moved during the night. I even placed a few leaves in certain formations outside the tent. Nothing obvious, but subtle little patterns that would shift if someone stepped near them. As the evening came, the cold wind made the trees shake, and the branches creaked in different pitches. I tried to enjoy the last bit of daylight, but I felt watched. It wasn't a dramatic feeling. It wasn't sudden. It was slow and heavy, like something had been paying attention for a long time. When darkness fell, it fell quickly. The forest absorbed the last light and turned into a thick mass of black shapes. I crawled into my tent earlier than usual, zipped it fully, and lay still for a long time. Every small noise outside made me tense. I tried to distract myself by focusing on my own breathing, counting each inhale and exhale. Hours passed before anything happened. I must have fallen asleep lightly because I opened my eyes the moment I heard it. A slow drag of a foot, then a pause, then another soft crack of a twig. Someone was walking near my tent again, but slower this time, almost like they were aware I might be awake. My whole body went stiff. I didn't sit up. I didn't move. I just kept my eyes open in the darkness of the tent, looking up at the faint outline of the fabric above me. The steps stopped right outside the wall, closer than last night, so close that I could hear the disturbed leaves settle slowly. I could feel my heartbeat pounding against the sleeping bag. Whoever it was stayed there, standing, breathing quietly. I couldn't hear the breath, but I could feel the presence through the thin wall of the tent. It felt like a weight in the air. Several minutes passed, though it felt like an hour. My muscles hurt from staying frozen. Sweat formed along my back even though the air was cold. I felt every second stretch until finally the steps moved again. Backward, slow, careful, and then faded into the forest. I didn't sleep at all after that. I stayed awake until the first hint of morning light hit the tent. When I stepped outside, everything was exactly the same as I had left it. Except one thing. One of my food containers, which I had closed tightly and placed under the fallen tree, had been moved a few inches. Not far, just enough to show someone had touched it. The leaves around it were flattened in a way that perfectly matched the shape of a knee pressing down. That was enough for me. I knew someone was watching me, someone who moved at night, someone who came right up to my tent and stayed there without any fear. Someone who had been studying the area around my camp even during the day, judging by the disturbed patches of ground I kept finding. I made the decision instantly. I packed up everything in less than 15 minutes. I kept my head up the whole time, scanning every direction. Every tree trunk seemed like it could hide someone. Every shadow looked deeper than it should. I didn't spot anything moving, but I felt watched from some distance. I began walking out of the clearing faster than I normally would. I didn't run, but my pace was sharp and steady. The forest felt alive in a new way, not peaceful, but alert, like it had been holding something for days and had finally shown me a small part of it. As I got farther from the clearing, I realized something else unsettling. The leaves along parts of the path showed signs of recent disturbance. Not mine. These were lighter, almost like someone had walked the path hours before me. Halfway back to the trailhead, I found something that made me stop cold. On the side of a large tree, scratched faintly into the bark, low around knee-height, were fresh marks. They weren't symbols. They weren't words. They looked like someone dragging a small piece of metal or a sharp rock across the bark over and over. The direction of the scratches pointed toward the clearing I had camped in. It was as if someone had marked the path I took. Or worse, marked the path they took following me. I didn't stop again after that. I kept going until I reached the dirt parking spot. My car was untouched. Everything looked exactly as it had the day I arrived. The normal world felt close again, but not close enough to make me feel safe. I unlocked the car, put my gear in quickly, and drove away without looking back. When I got home later that day, I unpacked everything and kept seeing those disturbed patches of leaves in my mind. I kept thinking about the careful steps outside my tent, the presence standing just inches from where I slept, the scratches on the tree pointing toward my camp. I thought about reporting it, but the reality was simple. No one had attacked me. No one had spoken to me. There was no proof of a crime. There was nothing except my own fear and a few subtle marks in the woods. Nothing someone could do anything about. But something had been there. Something human. Someone who lived or hid in that forest, moving silently, watching without reason, waiting for some unknown purpose. Someone whose path crossed mine in the worst way. And the ending became clear to me days later when I emptied the last of my gear. Inside one of my bags, buried at the bottom under clothes I hadn't used, was a handful of leaves. They weren't from anywhere near where I had packed. They were from the clearing. They had been placed, not fallen naturally. Someone had opened my bag while I slept. Someone had gone through my things when I had no idea. Someone had stood only a thin layer of fabric away from me. I realized then that leaving wasn't just the right choice. It was the only choice, because whoever was out there didn't want contact. They didn't want help. They didn't want anything normal. They wanted to get close without being seen. They wanted to watch without being known. They wanted to exist in that forest in a way normal people didn't understand. And I had wandered into their space, slept in their territory, and given them days to study me. I still think about the steps outside my tent. I think about how long they stood there. I think about the slow retreat into the darkness. I think about how close they were. I think about what might have happened if I had unzipped the tent, or made a sound, or moved too quickly. The forest is wide, empty, and quiet, but sometimes the things inside it aren't lost hikers or harmless animals. Sometimes they're people who choose to live outside everything that makes sense. People who learn to move silently. People who watch because they don't want to be watched back. I will never camp alone in a deep forest again. Not because of animals. Not because of weather. Not because of the dark. Because someone stood outside my tent in the middle of the night, and I still don't know why. I started the trip because I felt stuck in my routine, and I wanted something quiet for a few days. I thought a long drive into the forest and 2 nights of camping alone would help me clear my head. I packed simple food, a small stove, a tent, a sleeping bag, and enough water for 3 days. I picked an area that people didn't visit much, somewhere with old logging roads, dry leaves everywhere, long empty stretches of forest, and a single narrow track that ran miles away from the main road. I started the drive early in the morning. The air felt heavy even though the sky was clear, and the whole road looked like it had no end. As I drove deeper into the forest, I felt something I always felt in remote places, a mix of excitement and fear. The trees grew taller, the shadows thicker, and the noise of civilization faded behind me. At the same time, the silence around the forest felt heavier than usual, like it had weight. Even with the windows closed, I felt like I could hear deeper into that place than I wanted to. The road kept getting rougher. The gravel had long gaps where the rain had washed it out, and dry branches snapped under my tires. I kept checking my fuel gauge again and again, even though I knew I had filled up the tank before leaving. I told myself it was just caution, but I knew deep down that the farther I went, the more trapped I would become if something went wrong. I had no one to call, no signal, and no one even knew the exact coordinates of where I was going. After about an hour, I reached the old logging road. It was narrower, uneven, and mostly covered in fallen pine needles and soft dirt. The trees were so close on both sides that they almost scraped the truck. I drove slowly, looking around for any sign of a clearing that would work as a camp. Most of the forest looked untouched, thick, and tangled. Every time I stopped the truck to look at something, the silence felt strange, like something was listening. I kept moving until I finally found a small widening in the road. It wasn't a real campsite, but the ground was flat enough to set a tent. The trees around it stood so close together that the space felt like the center of a bowl. The air here was cooler, darker, and almost damp even though the day was dry. I stepped out of the truck and stood still. The forest didn't sound like anything. No birds, no insects, nothing moving. It felt like everything in that place was holding its breath. I unpacked slowly, trying to get used to the silence. I set the tent on the flattest ground I could find and placed my sleeping bag inside. I kept looking at the tree line without meaning to, expecting something to move. The heat of the day never reached inside that clearing. It was all shade, all stillness. Every small rustle from my gear felt louder than it should. I decided to walk around a little and get a sense of the area. I didn't go far, just a slow walk up and down the logging road. The ground was soft in places, and old tire tracks ran in long faded lines, as if someone had driven through there many months ago and not since. The trees looked untouched, like no one had walked between them in years. Some branches had fallen and dried so much that they looked like bones. When I got far enough from the camp, I turned and looked back, and for a second the clearing looked completely different. It looked like it wasn't mine, like I didn't belong there. Something about the pile of gear and the tent made it look small, exposed, and vulnerable. It was the same sort of feeling I had when standing in the middle of a big empty lot at night. That feeling of being visible even when you couldn't see anyone around you. I went back to the tent and tried to relax. I cooked a small meal on the stove, the smell of the fuel sharp and metallic in the air. I ate slowly, watching shadows shift under the trees. The forest stayed silent the whole time. Even as the sun dropped lower, nothing moved. I knew forests should make noise. I knew there should be birds calling, bugs buzzing, leaves fluttering, something. But there was nothing here except the sound of myself. When the sun finally dipped behind the trees, the cold came fast. Felt like night fell all at once. The clearing turned darker than it should have for the time, and the shadows around me grew thick. I cleaned up the stove and put everything in the truck so animals wouldn't smell it. I stood with my hands in my pockets, trying to breathe slow and act like I wasn't creeped out. That was when I heard the first sound that wasn't mine. It was faint, but sharp. Gravel shifting on the road. Not leaves, not branches. Gravel. The sound you hear when a foot steps on it, or when a tire rolls over it. I stood still and listened. The sound didn't repeat. I told myself the road was old, and maybe the heat had shifted something, or a piece of gravel fell down a small dip. I didn't believe that, but it was all I had. I climbed into my tent early, even though it was barely night. I sat in the sleeping bag with the flashlight off, trying to listen. The forest stayed still. My heartbeat felt louder than everything around me. It took a long time before I finally laid down. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but my mind kept turning the sound over and over. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. When I opened my eyes and looked at the tent ceiling, I realized what had woken me. There was a sound outside. Not footsteps, not an animal. It was the low rumble of an engine. A truck engine. Very slow, very controlled. Like someone was easing their vehicle down the road to avoid making sound. I froze inside the sleeping bag. My mouth went dry. I listened as the sound approached my clearing. The engine was moving at a steady crawl, not like someone just passing by. It sounded like someone driving carefully, trying to scan the area. The sound grew louder, then softened. I tried to picture the road outside. There wasn't enough space there for two vehicles. If someone was coming, they would see my truck, my tent, everything. The engine stopped. Not shut off, just stopped moving. I sat up silently, barely breathing. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I waited for any sign of movement, but the engine stayed idle at that same low rumble. Then it stopped. Completely. No engine noise. No door opening. No footsteps. Nothing. I waited for what felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. I didn't know if the person was still there, or if they had shut the engine off and stayed inside, or if they had walked away. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to make even the smallest sound. When I finally pulled myself together enough to act, I unzipped the sleeping bag slowly and reached for the flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I just sat there in the dark, waiting. After a long time, I started to think maybe the truck had turned around and left. Maybe the noise I heard was different than what I thought. Maybe I imagined some of it because I was tense. But I didn't sleep after that. When the sky finally started getting lighter, I got up as soon as I could see. I stepped out of the tent slowly and looked down the road. There were fresh tire marks. They were deep, clear, and very new. They came from the direction I had originally driven from, and they stopped just a few feet away from my camp before turning around sharply and heading back the way they came. Someone had driven right up to my clearing in the middle of the night, stopped, and then left. I felt weak in the stomach when I saw the tracks. Someone had found me in that huge empty forest. Someone had driven toward my tent, stopped just before entering the clearing, and stayed there in the dark without turning off the engine for a long time. I didn't know if they were watching me or checking my camp or thinking about something else entirely. But I knew something was wrong. It wasn't normal. I knew I should pack up and leave right away. But part of me didn't want to rush. I wanted to understand if the tracks meant danger or just an accidental passerby. I moved slowly, looking at the trees around me. I saw nothing out of place, but the feeling that I was being watched from somewhere deep in the forest stayed with me. I ate a small meal, but I barely tasted it. The air felt heavier than yesterday. I kept telling myself that maybe a hunter or someone scouting the area had driven by. But I knew that wasn't right. No one came out here at night, and no one drove this slow unless they were looking for something. I packed up most of my gear but kept the tent up. I didn't want to look panicked. I tried to walk around the area again, but every few steps I felt the urge to turn back. I couldn't focus on anything except the thought of someone out there thinking about the fact that I was alone in the forest. Around noon, I heard the sound again, the same low engine rumble, this time in daylight. My stomach twisted hard. I ducked behind a tree and looked down the road. The truck wasn't in sight yet, but the sound was steady, slow, and coming straight toward me again. I decided to go camping alone to clear my mind because everything in my life felt heavy and cluttered. I thought being out in the quiet would help me get away from all the noise that kept building up inside me. I picked a place I had never visited before, a national forest area that was known for being huge and mostly empty. I planned a simple route, about 8 kilometers into the woods, with a small loop around a ridge and then back to the main trail the next morning. I packed only what I needed: a tent, a sleeping bag, a few meals, a small stove, a map, a compass, extra water, a knife, a headlamp, and a small first aid kit. Everything felt normal when I stepped out of the car and smelled that clean forest air. I thought it would be the calm trip I needed. The first part of the hike felt good. The weather was cool, the ground was soft, and the trail looked like it hadn't been walked on in days. I liked that. I liked the feeling of moving deeper into the woods where the noise of the world faded behind me. The sun came through the trees in long, warm lines, brushing the trail in soft patches of light that shifted when the wind moved the branches. I kept checking the map to make sure I was on the right path, and everything lined up exactly the way it should have. After about 3 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing where the trees opened just enough for sunlight to touch the ground. It felt like a quiet spot, a place where the air held still. I set my pack down and drank some water while looking around at the trees, the moss on the trunks, the dead leaves that piled between roots. Everything felt normal until I noticed something strange near the edge of the clearing. There was a path, a narrow one, cut through the trees in a way that didn't match the rest of the forest. The ground looked disturbed, as if someone or something had been using it recently. I pulled out the map and looked for it but couldn't find anything like it. The map showed only the main trail and a few side trails, but nothing in the direction this one went. Normally, I wouldn't care about some random animal path, but something about it bothered me. It looked too straight, too intentional, and the dirt on it looked more like footprints had pressed into it rather than paws. I told myself I wouldn't go far, just far enough to see where it led. I left my pack in the clearing to keep things light and stepped onto the narrow path. Right away, I felt the air change. The light dimmed under the thick branches and the temperature dropped just enough for me to notice. The trees leaned close together, and the path wound through them in a way that almost felt like it had been cut on purpose. I walked slowly, paying attention to everything around me, listening to the small sounds of the forest. But after only a few minutes, I started seeing things that didn't belong there. A broken boot print in the dirt. A small pile of rocks stacked in a way that didn't look natural. A piece of torn fabric caught on a branch. Every new thing made my stomach tighten slowly, like something inside me had started turning the wrong way. I kept going, telling myself I would stop at the next turn, then the next and the next, until I realized I had gone much farther than I meant to. The path suddenly opened into a wider area. The ground dipped slightly, forming a shallow bowl surrounded by trees. In the center of it was something that made me stop moving altogether. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It looked like a pile of branches and logs, but when I stepped closer, I saw that it wasn't a natural pile. Someone had built it. Someone had shaped the branches into a crude shelter, not big enough to stand in, but large enough for someone to crawl into. The shelter looked old but used. The leaves piled around it looked disturbed, and the dirt had smooth patches like someone had been lying there recently. There were marks on the logs that looked like they had been cut with a small knife. I felt a cold sensation crawl up my neck as I walked around the shelter, looking for more signs. On the ground nearby, I found small bones. They looked like they belonged to small animals. They were cleaned too neatly to have been eaten by a wild animal. The air felt heavier now. I could feel something watching me even though I could not see anything around me. I slowly backed away from the shelter and started walking back toward the clearing. Every sound felt louder than before. Every rustle of leaves sounded close. I kept my steps steady, resisting the urge to run. When I reached the clearing, I felt a small wave of relief. My pack was still there exactly where I left it, and the forest looked normal again. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling as I continued along the original trail, pretending that the strange path and shelter were nothing more than some abandoned survival spot left by some hiker. But my mind kept replaying the details. The fresh footprints, the stacked rocks, the knife marks on the wood. Nothing about it felt like it had been left behind. Felt used, recent, lived in. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the rest of the hike. I followed the trail deeper into the forest, watching the light slowly fade as the sun dropped lower behind the trees. I finally reached the place where I planned to camp, a flat spot near a small ridge that looked down into a valley. I set up my tent, boiled some water for food, and tried to relax. The sky turned darker, and the forest around me shifted into that nighttime atmosphere where everything gets quiet except for the wind and insects. Normally, I enjoyed this part of camping, but this time I felt tense. I kept glancing toward the trees around me, expecting to see movement even though there was none. When the sun completely disappeared, the forest became darker than I expected. My headlamp created a small circle of light that felt too weak compared to the darkness outside. After eating, I climbed into my tent and lay down, listening to the wind brush against the nylon. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept going back to the hidden shelter. The idea that someone lived out there, someone who didn't want to be found, kept circling in my head. Around midnight, I heard the first sound that made me freeze completely. Sticks snapping. Not small ones, heavy ones, the kind that break under a solid weight. At first, I told myself it was a deer, or maybe a bear. Animals walked around campsites all the time, but the sound didn't move like an animal. It didn't pace, it didn't wander. Stopped and paused, as if listening. The breaking of sticks came again, but slower this time, like something was stepping carefully. I stayed still inside the tent, barely breathing. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my hands. I wanted to reach for the knife inside my bag near my feet, but I didn't want to make any noise. I stayed frozen while the steps grew closer. The sound seemed to be circling the edge of my campsite, slow and deliberate. Every step pressed into the ground with weight behind it. Then I heard breathing. Not animal breathing, human breathing. Slow, steady, controlled. A wave of fear went through me so fast that I felt dizzy for a moment. I stayed flat on my back, staring at the roof of the tent, listening to the breathing hover outside. I couldn't tell exactly where the sound came from, but it felt only a few meters away. The breathing stopped. For a few seconds, everything went silent except for the wind. Then I heard footsteps again, moving away. The steps faded slowly until they disappeared completely. I stayed awake for hours, unable to close my eyes. Every small sound outside made me tense up again. I kept thinking about the shelter, the bones, the knife marks, and now the breathing. Someone was out there, and they knew I was there. When morning finally arrived, the forest looked calm again. The sunlight coming through the trees felt warmer than usual, as if it was trying to erase the memory of the night. I stepped outside the tent and looked around the campsite carefully. The ground didn't show clear tracks because the leaves were thick, but I could see certain spots where the leaves had been pressed down in fresh shapes, too large to be from an animal. I packed my things quickly, eager to get out of the forest. My plan was to hike back to my car using the same trail I came in on. The sooner I got out of the woods, the better. But as I started walking, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten again. Footprint. A human footprint. Fresh. Right on top of the trail in front of me. Pointed in the same direction I was heading. At first I thought maybe it belonged to someone else who hiked early in the morning. But the deeper I went, the more the prints appeared, always ahead of me, always leading the way as if guiding me out or waiting for me to follow. About 3 kilometers into the return hike, I saw something that made me stop moving altogether. A piece of bright yellow fabric tied to a tree. I knew right away that it wasn't natural because I recognized the color. It was the same color as a strap on my backpack. I looked closely and saw that it wasn't the same material, but it was close enough to feel off. Someone had tied it at eye level, as if marking the trail, as if marking the path for me. I kept going, my heart racing, my breathing tight. Every few minutes I noticed small signs. A pile of rocks, a broken branch leaning in a strange angle, a strip of bark removed from a tree. They were spaced out in a way that felt intentional, as if trying to keep me on the path or keep me moving forward. Then I realized something that made everything worse. None of those signs had been there when I hiked in. Someone had placed them overnight. About 2 hours into the hike, I started hearing movement behind me. At first it was faint, like leaves shifting under weight, but then I heard steady steps that matched mine in rhythm. Whenever I stopped, the steps stopped. Whenever I moved, they moved. I never looked back because something inside me told me not to. I just kept walking as fast as I could without breaking into a run. The closer I got to the trailhead, the louder the sounds behind me became. I could hear breathing again, closer this time, not even trying to hide. The steps cracked sticks and pressed into the ground hard enough to echo. My hands shook, my legs felt weak, and the forest suddenly felt too quiet except for the footsteps chasing me. When I was still about 1 kilometer away from the car, the footsteps suddenly sped up. They pressed harder into the ground, snapping branches in quick, heavy bursts. I forced my legs to move faster. The trail was uneven, filled with roots and rocks, but I didn't care. I felt something closing the distance behind me. I heard the deep, steady breathing again, closer than ever. When I broke out of the trees and saw the parking lot through the branches, I pushed myself even harder. My chest burned, my eyes watered, and every sound behind me felt like it was only a few meters away. I didn't look back. I reached the edge of the trail, ran across the dirt lot, and didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands fumbled with the keys as I unlocked the door and jumped inside. I shut the door, locked it, and sat there gasping for air, staring at the trail entrance. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The entrance was quiet, the trees still, the sunlight soft and warm. It looked like any other peaceful forest morning. Then something moved at the tree line. A figure, tall, thin, wearing something dark and dirty. I couldn't see the face because the branches cast shadows over it. The figure stayed just inside the tree line, not stepping into the open, not moving forward. It only stood there, watching. The posture didn't look casual or confused. It looked intentional, as if the figure had stopped the chase not because it was scared, but because it simply decided it was enough. I turned the engine on and drove away without looking back again. I didn't feel safe even after leaving the forest behind. My hands shook on the steering wheel the whole drive home. Every time I stopped at a red light, I checked the rearview mirror again and again. Even after I reached my house, the feeling stayed with me. I checked the windows, the locks, the yard. I barely slept that night, listening for any sound outside. In the days that followed, I tried convincing myself that everything would be fine now that I was home. But the memory of the shelter, the footprints, the breathing, and the figure at the tree line stayed in my head every hour of the day. I couldn't forget the way the footsteps matched mine. I couldn't forget the way the person followed me through the forest without ever saying a single word or making any noise that wasn't intentional. I looked up local reports about missing people or forest incidents. I found nothing. I searched for any mention of someone living deep in the woods. Nothing. It felt like whoever I encountered wasn't part of any report, any group, or any problem that people knew about. It felt like I had stumbled into someone's hidden life, someone who didn't want company, someone who didn't want their area discovered, someone who followed me all night and all morning without hesitation. The memory still follows me everywhere. I think about the markings on the trees, the bones around the shelter, the quiet, heavy breathing outside my tent, the footsteps behind me on the trail. I think about the way the figure stood at the tree line, watching me drive away, as if memorizing me the same way I was trying to forget them. I keep telling myself they stayed in the forest, that they had no reason to follow me home. But some nights, when everything is quiet and the house settles after dark, I still feel that same pressure I felt in the forest, the feeling of someone watching from just out of sight. And the worst part is that I know I wasn't lost. I know I didn't wander into the wrong place by accident. I know that the path I found, the one that wasn't on the map, wasn't made for animals. It was made for people. Someone made it, someone used it, and someone followed me out. Every time I close my eyes, all I see is that figure at the tree line, standing perfectly still, letting me leave only because they wanted to. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. I went camping alone in the mountains at the end of summer because I wanted to clear my head after months of stress. I picked a place far from any crowded trails, a spot I had found once on a long hike the previous year. It was a flat patch of ground near a small stream, with tall pines surrounding it on 3 sides and a slow downhill slope on the 4th side leading deeper into the forest. I remembered how quiet it felt there, how the air seemed to sit still and cold even in summer. I wanted that silence again. I drove until the road turned to rough gravel and then to dirt, and I parked at a clearing about 2 hours from the main highway. I loaded my pack, tightened the straps, and started the hike to the spot. The trail had narrowed since last year. The bushes and small trees had grown in, and their thin branches slapped against my legs as I walked. The air smelled like dry pine needles and warm dust. The only sounds were wind moving high above me and the crunch of my boots on old leaves. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was hanging low between the tree trunks. The light came in at a slant, making the dust flicker in the air. I dropped my backpack and stretched my shoulders. The stream was still there, curling gently around smooth rocks. The ground still had the same uneven patches I remembered, felt almost untouched. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, because I wanted to settle my mind into the quiet. I set up my tent under a cluster of tall trees where the branches were so thick that barely any sunlight reached the ground. The dim shade made it feel cooler than the rest of the woods. After the tent was up, I stacked some firewood near a spot where someone long ago had set stones in a circle. The stones were weathered and mossy. It looked like nobody had camped there for a long time. As I worked, I kept feeling something strange about the silence. It wasn't peaceful the way I remembered. It felt heavy, like the kind of silence that comes when someone is holding their breath. Every time I stopped moving, I listened closely. The wind in the trees sounded normal. The stream sounded normal, but there was something underneath it, something barely there, like the faint crunch of footsteps very far away or the soft scrape of something brushing against bark. Every time I tried to focus on it, I heard nothing. When I moved again, the feeling returned. I told myself I was being paranoid. I had been stressed for months. My mind was probably still too busy and too tight. I gathered more firewood, walked back to my pack, and tried to relax. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. As the evening came, I made a small fire. I cooked a simple meal and ate slowly. The sky turned orange through the trees and then purple. When darkness finally settled in, it felt thicker and heavier than any forest night I had experienced. The trees around the campsite blocked out the moon almost completely. My fire made a small circle of light around me, but everything outside it was black, not even the outline of tree trunks visible. I sat for a while watching the fire burn low. Every minute or so I glanced toward the dark woods behind my tent because I kept getting the sense that something was there. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like the feeling of someone standing behind you in a crowded place, the weight of another person in your space. I leaned back and tried to breathe slow, telling myself nothing was out there. But as the fire dropped to glowing coals, I heard something. It was faint, but it was real. A single sharp snap of a stick somewhere in the woods to my left. The sound was quick, but it carried through the still night. I lifted my head and stared into the dark. The firelight didn't reach far enough to show anything. A few seconds passed. Then I heard a soft rustle, like someone shifting their weight on dry leaves. I stayed still, listening. The rustle stopped. I waited for it to start again, but it didn't. I told myself animals wandered through forests all the time. Deer, raccoons, anything. Sounds happened at night. The darkness only made it feel worse than it was. I put out the fire, zipped myself into my tent, and lay down on my sleeping bag. I tried to keep my breathing steady. I felt safer with the tent closed, even though I knew it was just a thin layer of fabric. The forest outside was still. The stream was the only thing making noise, a slow trickle. I closed my eyes. Sometime later, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was, but the air inside the tent felt colder. My back was stiff and my mouth was dry. I wasn't sure what woke me until I heard it again. A soft crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate, like someone taking careful steps just outside the tent. I froze. My eyes were open now, staring at the roof of the tent. The sound moved again, slightly to the right this time. It wasn't fast. It wasn't random. It sounded like walking, slow walking. The weight of each step pressed into the forest floor. I didn't move. I kept my breathing as quiet as possible. The steps got closer. Then they stopped directly outside my tent. The air felt thin. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it shaking in my chest. I waited for the sound again, but nothing happened. It was like whoever or whatever it was had stopped right there and was just standing still. Minutes passed. At least it felt like minutes. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. Eventually the steps started again, moving away this time. They faded slowly into the distance until I couldn't hear anything except the stream. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I waited on my back with my eyes open until the sky outside turned pale gray. When the light grew stronger, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped outside. The cold morning air felt sharp on my skin. I looked around carefully. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing looked unusual. The trees were still, the ground untouched except for my own footprints from yesterday. I tried to laugh it off in my mind. Maybe it had been an animal walking close to the tent. Maybe I had exaggerated the sound in the darkness. I made breakfast, drank water from the stream after filtering it, and walked around the area trying to convince myself everything was normal. But then I saw the footprints. They were on the slope just behind the trees near my tent. The ground there was soft and slightly muddy. There were shoe prints, clear and recent, pointing toward my campsite. Not boot prints, not hiking shoes. They looked like normal sneakers, the kind with a simple sole pattern. My mind froze for a moment. Someone had been there in the night. Someone with normal shoes. Someone walking slowly around my tent. I followed the prints a little way. They came from the deeper forest and stopped near my campsite. There were a few prints circling. Then more prints led back into the woods, heading downhill into the darker trees. I felt sick. This was far from any normal trail. No one would be wandering here by accident. Whoever it was had come specifically near my camp in the middle of the night. I didn't want to panic, so I forced myself to sit and think. My first thought was packing up and leaving right away, but part of me resisted. I told myself it might have been a hunter or someone lost. I didn't want to feel like I was running from nothing. and I didn't want to hike back to my car feeling paranoid every step of the way. I decided to stay one more day, but to stay alert. I kept my knife on my belt at all times. I moved my food closer. I spent most of the day listening for anything unusual. The forest was quiet all morning, but in the afternoon, I noticed something strange. A single tree about 40 yards away had long scratches on its bark. Not animal scratches, but marks that looked like they were made with a knife or some sharp object. They were fresh. The exposed wood was light in color. There were no footprints near it, but the scratches looked deliberate. I stared at them for a long time. I kept imagining someone standing there, dragging a blade down the bark while watching my camp through the trees. The thought crawled under my skin. As evening came again, the silence in the forest returned. The air felt heavier than the night before. When the sun went down, the shadows seemed darker, almost thick enough to touch. I built a small fire, but it didn't help the feeling. It only made the dark edges look sharper. I sat by the fire for hours, watching every direction. I kept hearing faint sounds from the forest. Sometimes it was a branch dropping. Sometimes it was a rustle that felt too controlled. Every time I looked toward the noise, I saw nothing. When the fire burned low again, I didn't want to go inside the tent. I didn't want to be trapped, but I also didn't want to stay exposed outside. Eventually, I forced myself to go in, zipped the tent, and sat upright with my flashlight ready. I waited. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they came from the slope behind the trees. Slow footsteps, careful footsteps. They came closer, moving in a half circle around the tent just like the night before. I gripped my flashlight so hard my hand hurt. The steps stopped again right outside. I knew someone was standing there. I could feel the weight of their presence. Then something new happened. The tent wall near my feet pressed inward slightly, like someone was gently touching the fabric from the outside. I pulled my feet back slowly. The pressure stayed for a few seconds, then released. I didn't breathe. Every muscle in my body felt locked. The person outside moved slowly along the tent. Their shadow brushed against the faint moonlight coming through the thin fabric. I could see a shape, a tall shape, standing close, too close. Then the sound stopped again. Silence. I waited, staring at the tent wall, afraid to blink. Then I heard breathing. Not my own. Heavy breathing from outside the tent. Slow and steady, like someone was standing inches away, listening to me. I felt sweat run down my back even though the air was cold. The breathing stayed for a long time. I didn't know how long. It felt like forever. Finally, the footsteps started again, moving away. They faded slowly until the forest was silent. I didn't sleep again. When the first light came, I unzipped the tent with trembling hands and stepped out. I checked the ground. The same sneaker prints were everywhere, circling the tent, stopping at the exact places where the person stood. They led back into the forest again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands kept shaking. I kept looking at the tree line, expecting someone to step out at any moment. When I finished, I strapped on my backpack and started up the trail. But after maybe 5 minutes of walking, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints on the trail ahead of me. The same sneakers. The prints were fresh. They weren't there when I arrived yesterday. Someone had walked up the same trail I had used, and they had walked toward my campsite. I kept walking, but every few minutes I checked behind me. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anyone. About halfway back to my car, I noticed another set of prints. They were on the side of the trail this time, as if someone had stepped off to hide behind a tree. The prints faced the trail. They were positioned perfectly to watch someone walk by. I kept moving, faster. My breath came hard and loud. The forest didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt like it was watching me. When I reached the clearing where I parked, I saw something that made all the fear in my body spike at once. My car door was open, not wide, but just enough that it wasn't fully closed. I knew I had shut it when I parked. I remembered the click of the latch. I approached slowly. The ground near the car had the same sneaker prints, several of them. Whoever was at my tent had been at my car too. They had looked inside. Maybe they had waited there. I checked the back seat carefully, keeping my knife ready. It was empty, but the glove compartment was open, and things that had been inside were moved around. I got into the car, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine. The feeling of driving out of that clearing was the strongest relief I had felt in months. But the fear didn't stop. I kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds on the long road back to the highway. When I reached signal again, I pulled over at a gas station and sat in the car for a long time. I tried to slow my breathing, but my hands kept shaking. I kept imagining the footsteps outside my tent, the heavy breathing, the fresh footprints, the scratches on the tree. It all connected in a way that made too much sense. Someone had watched me the moment I arrived. Someone had walked around my camp at night. Someone had stood inches from me while I lay helpless inside the tent. Someone had looked inside my car. Someone had followed my steps on the trail. The reality hit me hard. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a random person wandering the woods. It wasn't a lost hiker or a hunter. Whoever it was had been stalking me deliberately, watching me sleep, moving around my tent, studying the campsite, checking my car, following the trail I used. They didn't say anything. They didn't show themselves. They didn't attack. They just watched. They waited. They stayed close enough to breathe on the tent wall. That quiet, unnatural patience scared me more than anything else. The ending became even clearer to me weeks later, when I looked up news stories from that region. I found an article about a missing person case. A man had vanished months before. His abandoned campsite was found deep in the forest. The report said his backpack was still there, his tent was slashed open, and footprints were found circling the site. Sneaker prints with the same simple sole pattern I had seen in the mud. The man was never found. After I read that, everything inside me locked up in a tight, cold feeling. I realized how close I had come to being the next missing hiker. I realized that if I had stayed one more night, if I had stepped outside the tent at the wrong moment, if I had walked off the trail to check a noise, I might have disappeared too. The forest had felt like it was holding its breath because someone inside it had been waiting, quiet, patient, close enough to touch the walls of my tent while I lay alone in the dark. I never went back to that place again. I don't camp alone anymore. Sometimes I still wake up at night thinking I hear footsteps outside my window, those same slow and careful steps pressing into the ground. I know it's only my mind replaying what happened, but the memory stays sharp. The ending is simple and clear. I survived because I left. The person stalking me didn't chase me. They didn't speak. They just waited for me to make a mistake. When I didn't, they disappeared back into the trees. Someone else wasn't so lucky. Asterisk, asterisk. But the scariest part is knowing the truth. That person is still out there somewhere. And they know how to move in the woods without being heard. They know how to stand inches away from someone without making a sound. They know how to wait. Asterisk, asterisk. And they are probably still waiting. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I needed a break from the endless noise of the city, the constant pressure of work, and the small but persistent anxieties that built up in my chest day after day. I wanted the forest, the quiet, and the sense of being small in a huge, untamed world. I packed my backpack with care. A tent, a sleeping bag, a lightweight stove, enough food for 4 days, a water filter, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and extra batteries. I had maps, a compass, and I even marked my route on a GPS device just in case. I was careful. I had done my research. I knew this forest was remote but not dangerous, or at least not by any obvious measures. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, when the air was crisp and cool. Mist still clung to the tops of the trees, curling around the trunks like thin smoke. The parking lot was empty except for one other car, and I felt a strange comfort in knowing I might see another human, though the solitude I sought was already beginning to settle around me. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and began the long walk down the trail. It was steep at first, and my legs burned pleasantly as I hiked deeper into the forest, each step taking me further from the familiar and closer to the unknown. The trail twisted and wound between towering pines, their needles carpeting the ground in a soft, springy layer. The air smelled of damp earth, resin, and the faint sweetness of pine sap. I kept my pace steady, enjoying the sound of my boots against the packed dirt and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Birds called from above, though their songs were intermittent, interrupted by the wind shaking the higher branches. After a few hours, the trail leveled out, and I found a small clearing beside a stream. The water moved fast over smooth stones, making a steady, soothing sound. I decided it was a good place to take a break, to eat some trail mix and drink water before pushing further into the forest. By mid-afternoon, I had hiked several more miles and found a small ridge that offered a good view of the valley below. I paused there, catching my breath and letting my eyes wander over the treetops. I noticed the forest stretching endlessly in every direction, green and thick and absolutely silent aside from the wind and the faint babble of distant streams. I felt a twinge of exhilaration, a mixture of awe and fear at how alone I truly was. I checked my map and compass, marking my location, and then I continued on. As the sun began to lower, I knew I had to find a proper spot to set up camp. I found a small clearing surrounded by pines and oaks. It was flat enough for a tent and close to a stream for water. I set up my tent carefully, hammering the stakes into the hard, root-strewn soil. Inside, I organized my gear neatly, laying out my sleeping bag, stove, and food in a way that would make sense in the dark. I made a small fire pit with a circle of stones, even though I would only light it later, when the sun had fully disappeared behind the trees. By the time I was finished setting up, the sky was a deep orange, fading into purple. I lit a small fire, careful to keep it contained, and cooked a simple dinner of pasta and vegetables from a pouch. The smell filled the clearing, warm and comforting. I ate slowly, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of water nearby. The forest was alive in subtle ways. The chirp of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant caw of a crow. Everything felt normal, safe, even soothing. But as the sky darkened, the feeling of being watched began to creep in. At first, it was subtle, almost my imagination. The shadows cast by my fire flickered against the trees, making the darkness between them seem alive. I shook the thought away, telling myself I had been alone in the woods enough times to know it was normal to feel on edge when the light faded. I cleaned up my camp carefully, putting all food away and dousing the fire almost entirely, leaving only a small ember for light. I zipped my tent, double-checked my backpack, and lay down, listening to the sounds of the night. The first few hours were peaceful. I drifted in and out of sleep, waking occasionally to the sounds of nocturnal animals moving through the underbrush. Then, around midnight, I heard it. First, I wasn't sure. A snap of a twig, faint, careful, deliberate. My heart rate jumped, and I froze, straining my ears. Another sound, closer this time. Something moving just beyond the reach of the firelight, careful, deliberate. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the thought did little to calm me. There was no pattern to the movement like a grazing deer. It was slow, measured, almost human. I tried to remain calm, breathing slowly, telling myself I was safe inside the tent. I had a flashlight and a knife within reach, and I could see the faint outline of the clearing through the mesh of the tent. I listened for minutes that felt like hours. Then came the sound of heavy breathing, low and deliberate, outside my tent. My stomach tightened into knots. There was no way this was a deer. No deer breathed like that. My mind raced through possibilities. Someone could be lost like me, maybe another camper, but then why hide? I remembered the other car at the trailhead, miles away, and realized the forest could be empty for hours in any direction. My heart pounded, and I realized I could not stay in that tent alone with someone, or something, lurking outside. I gathered my courage and carefully unzipped the tent just a little to peek out. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness. Nothing. Only the trees and the faint reflection of the stream under the moonlight. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself I had imagined it, but the sound of twigs snapping returned, from a different direction this time, slower. The hair on my arms stood up. I knew then that I was not imagining things. Someone or something was out there, moving in the shadows, watching. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get to safety. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed in my essentials: water, food, flashlight, knife, and left the tent zipped. Moving quietly, I followed the small path I had made earlier, sticking close to the edge of the forest. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks making every step precarious, but fear sharpened my senses. I could hear every sound: my boots crunching on fallen leaves, twigs snapping underfoot, the distant call of an owl. The movement outside seemed to follow me, keeping pace, but always staying just out of sight. I forced myself to keep moving, keeping the beam of my flashlight low, scanning for any sign of the presence I felt behind me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed irrelevant. Every sound set my heart racing. A shadow moved between two trees. I froze, convinced it was the person or animal following me. But the shadow vanished when I pointed my light, leaving only the forest as empty as it had been before. Panic threatened to take over, but I forced myself to keep moving toward the stream, which I remembered would eventually lead to a dirt road I had passed hours earlier. Eventually, just before dawn, I reached the stream and followed it carefully. My legs ached, my hands were scratched from branches, and my face was streaked with sweat and dirt. I reminded myself to stay quiet, to stay alert. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I finally spotted a faint trail that matched the path back toward the trailhead. My heart leapt. I hurried, stumbling and tripping, but never stopping, never looking back. By mid-morning, exhausted and covered in scratches, I emerged from the forest onto the road where I had parked. The other car was gone, the trailhead empty, and I collapsed into my own vehicle, hands shaking, heart racing. I sat there for a long while, staring at the road ahead, trying to process everything. Eventually, I drove back to the nearest town. I reported the strange presence in the forest to the ranger station, and they told me there had been reports of trespassers in that area, people sneaking into restricted land. It was illegal, dangerous, and sometimes violent. No one had been caught yet. I realized I had come face to face with someone hiding in the forest, someone willing to follow a lone camper for hours, waiting in the shadows. The fear was real, but so was the relief of making it out. I learned that the forest, though beautiful, could be unforgiving not just because of nature, but because of people. I never returned to that trail, and I never camped alone in that area again. I stayed cautious after that, always checking for signs of human presence, always carrying extra protection, and always remembering that being prepared and aware could mean the difference between coming home safe and becoming another story lost in the forest. I had been waiting for months to take a long camping trip alone. I had been working almost every day, barely sleeping, barely eating well, and always sitting in the same chair. I felt like my mind was getting foggy, like my thoughts were moving slower. I just wanted to get away from everything for a few days, far away from people, traffic, noise, and work. I wanted to sit by a fire and listen to nothing but the sound of trees moving in the wind. I picked a place that almost no one talked about, a large forest about 3 hours away. It wasn't a famous park, and most people didn't go that deep into it. That made it perfect for me. I left early in the morning before the sun came out. The air was cold, and my breath looked like smoke moving in front of me every time I exhaled. I drove with the windows slightly open because I liked the feel of the cold air hitting my face. The road was empty for most of the drive, and I felt more relaxed than I had in months. When I finally reached the dirt road that led into the forest, I slowed the car down because the ground was uneven and full of rocks. The deeper I drove, the darker the forest became. The trees were packed tightly together, their branches long and heavy, blocking out most of the sky. After about 20 minutes of slow driving, I finally reached the small opening I had marked on my map days earlier. It wasn't an official campsite. It was just a flat spot near a river that I found on satellite view. I parked the car under a group of tall pines and stepped out. The first thing I heard was the soft sound of running water. It made the place feel alive. The air smelled clean, and the wind was cold enough to keep my skin awake. I set my tent up close to the river, but not too close, making sure the ground was firm. I took my time setting everything up because I wanted to make sure nothing would fall apart later when the temperature dropped. After I finished setting my tent, I unpacked my supplies, organized my food, filled my water bottle from the river, and carried some dry branches to build a fire later. I walked around for a little while to explore the area. The ground was covered in soft dirt, dead leaves, and thick roots that twisted in and out of the soil. The river looked clear and slow, and the sunlight hit it in a way that made it look like a long piece of broken glass. The place felt peaceful. It felt empty, felt safe. At least that's what I thought. The first strange thing happened about an hour after I finished exploring. I was sitting on a log, trying to enjoy the quiet. I was looking at the river when I heard something heavy step on a branch behind me. It wasn't the sound of a small animal. It was something with weight, snapped loudly. I turned around slowly, expecting to see a deer or maybe a large dog from some nearby property. But I didn't see anything. The forest behind me looked the same as before. Thick trees, brown dirt, low bushes, nothing moving. I stayed still for a moment, trying to listen for more, but the forest went quiet. Even the birds stopped making noise. I didn't think much of it at first. Forests are full of animals. Things move all the time, but the sound stayed in my mind. It was too heavy to ignore completely. I shook the feeling away and went back to what I was doing. Later in the afternoon, I started preparing for the night. I gathered more firewood, checked my tent stakes, and made sure my flashlight had enough battery. I planned to cook a small meal before the sun disappeared. While I was collecting wood not far from my tent, I noticed something strange in the dirt. A footprint. Not an animal print, an actual shoe print. It wasn't mine. It was larger than my foot and deeper in the soil. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand how it got there. I had not seen any other cars. I had not heard any voices. I thought maybe it was old. Maybe someone had camped here weeks earlier. But it looked too fresh. The dirt around it was still soft, and the edges were clean, not smoothed over by rain or wind. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. Forests are open. Anyone could have passed by at some point. I went back to my campsite, but the footprint stayed in my mind like a weight pressing against the back of my thoughts. As the sun began to set, the forest changed. The light faded quickly, and the trees looked darker, almost like they were closing in around me. The temperature dropped, and the wind felt colder. I lit a fire and warmed my hands. The flames flickered in front of me, throwing a soft orange light over the dirt and the lower trunks of the trees. The sound of the river mixed with the crackling fire, creating a steady rhythm that made the place feel almost peaceful again. But I could not relax. The thought of the footprint and the sound of the heavy step behind me kept floating back into my mind. I kept looking over my shoulder even though I saw nothing but trees. I sat closer to the fire and tried to focus on the warmth. When the sky turned fully dark, the forest became almost silent. I could hear the river, the fire, and the occasional rustle of branches swaying in the wind. But there were no insects, no distant animal sounds. It felt like everything around me was holding its breath. I tried to eat something, but I felt too tense. I kept feeling like something was watching me from the darkness between the trees. My eyes kept drifting toward the shadowy areas just outside the firelight. Every few minutes, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye. A branch shifting, a shadow leaning slightly to the side, a dark shape between two trees. Each time I looked straight at it, the movement stopped. After sitting like that for a long time, I decided to go into my tent and try to sleep. I let the fire burn low, zipped up the tent, and lay down in my sleeping bag. The ground was cold and uneven, and my body felt stiff. I closed my eyes, but my mind wouldn't rest. I kept thinking about the footprint and the sound of something heavy stepping on a branch. After what felt like an hour of lying still, I heard something again. Soft footsteps, slow, careful, moving near the edge of my campsite. My eyes opened instantly. My body froze. The footsteps were steady, one after another, crushing the leaves and small twigs on the ground. They sounded too slow to belong to an animal, too precise, too controlled, like someone walking carefully, trying not to be heard. My heart started beating so hard that I could hear the thumping inside my chest. I held my breath, afraid that even the sound of my breathing would give away my exact position inside the tent. The footsteps moved closer, coming to the side of my tent. I could feel the presence of something or someone just outside, standing very still. Then I heard the faint sound of someone breathing lightly, as if they were listening for me, trying to figure out if I was awake. I stayed completely still. My hands were shaking inside my sleeping bag. I waited, hoping the person would walk away, but the presence stayed for a long time. It felt like hours, even though it must have been minutes. Eventually, the footsteps moved again, slowly stepping away from the tent, disappearing into the darkness of the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept my eyes open and listened for every sound. My body stayed tense the entire time, every muscle tight. I waited for the footsteps to return, but they didn't. When the first bit of morning light came through the thin fabric of the tent, I finally unzipped it and stepped outside. The air was freezing, but the cold felt good because it meant I was still alive. I looked around the campsite carefully. The fire had burned into black ash. The trees were still. The river was quiet. Then I saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones. Deep ones. All around the perimeter of my campsite. Someone had walked in a full circle around my tent during the night. The prints were large and spaced in a way that told me the person had been taking slow, deliberate steps. I counted maybe 20 prints, maybe more. They formed a clear loop around my tent, not random wandering. It was intentional. I felt my stomach twist. I knew I shouldn't stay another night. I started packing my things as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly that I kept dropping things on the ground. I checked the trees constantly. I checked the shadows between the branches. Every sound made me jerk my head around. While packing my final things into the car, I looked at the tree line near the footprint I first found the previous day. Something on the ground caught my eye. A small piece of fabric, caught on a low branch. It looked like torn clothing. Something a person might tear by accident while squeezing between trees. It looked new. It hadn't been rained on. It hadn't faded. Someone had been there very recently. I got into my car and locked the doors. I sat still for a moment, trying to slow my breathing. Then I started the engine. The sound of the motor breaking the silence felt strange, almost too loud. I drove slowly at first, then faster once I reached the dirt road. I didn't look in the mirrors. I didn't want to see anything behind me. When I reached the main road, I finally looked. And that's when I saw something that made my skin crawl. Far in the distance, near where the dirt road met the tree line, a figure was standing. A tall figure, not moving, just standing there, facing the road. I couldn't see details. I couldn't see the face, but I could tell it was a person, watching. I pushed the gas pedal harder and didn't slow down again until I reached a busy area with people, shops, and noise. Only then did I start to feel like I could breathe again. For days after that, I kept thinking about the footprints circling my tent. I kept thinking about the sound of someone breathing just outside the thin wall of fabric while I lay there helpless. I kept thinking about the piece of torn fabric left on that low branch. But the detail that stayed in my mind the longest was the way the figure stood at the edge of the forest as I drove away. Still, silent, watching me leave. It made me realize something that didn't hit me fully until much later. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. They weren't accidentally passing through my campsite. They had been watching me from the moment I arrived. They had walked around my tent because they wanted to get close. They chose not to hurt me that night, but they were right there, just one thin piece of fabric away from me. The forest had felt peaceful when I arrived. Empty, safe, but it wasn't empty at all. Someone else was out there the entire time. And the truth I understood at the end was simple but terrifying. I didn't escape because I was prepared. I didn't escape because I was smart. I only escaped because the person watching me decided to let me leave. Asterisk asterisk. They could have stepped into my campsite at any moment. They could have opened my tent. They could have waited until I fell asleep. They could have walked inside without me ever knowing until it was too late. They didn't, and that thought scared me even more than anything else that happened. Because it meant that the person out there wasn't just dangerous, they were patient. They were studying me. They liked watching me panic inside the tent. They liked walking slow circles around me. They liked knowing I couldn't see them. I still think about it at night sometimes, when the house is quiet. I picture the footprints in the dirt. I picture the torn fabric. I picture the shadowy figure standing far behind me as I drove away. And I always end up thinking the same thing. If they had decided to take one step closer, even one step, I would have disappeared into that forest without anyone knowing where to start looking. I never went camping alone again. I had been planning the trip for months, thinking it would help clear my head after weeks of stress. I wanted something quiet, something far from any town, something that made me feel cut off from all the noise that was building inside my mind. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going because I thought the place was too simple to matter. It was an old forest area miles away from the nearest small road, a place that didn't show up on most maps anymore. It was a long drive followed by a long walk, and I liked that idea because it made me feel like I was stepping out of the world for a bit. I parked my car near a small dirt clearing and took my heavy backpack, checking everything inside it again. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small cook stove, water bottles, food, a knife, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with backup batteries. Everything seemed fine. The air felt cold when I stepped out, and there was no sound except the soft wind pushing through the trees. It felt nice at that moment, like I had chosen the right place to be alone. The path leading deeper into the forest was uneven and narrow, covered with fallen leaves, broken branches, and old roots that stuck out from the ground like they were trying to trip anyone who walked over them. I walked slowly, feeling the weight of the bag press down on my shoulders, and I watched how the sunlight kept getting weaker as the trees grew thicker. Every now and then, I stopped to take a deep breath because the scent of the forest was strong, damp, and earthy, something that reminded me of old woodsheds. I walked for almost an hour before finding a flat area surrounded by tall trees and thick bushes. It looked like the kind of place nobody came to. The ground was soft, the air still, and there were no signs of other campers. I liked it right away. I dropped my bag, my shoulders relieved, and stood there for a long moment, listening and observing everything around me. I felt alone in the best way, like the forest had wrapped around me and swallowed the rest of the world. I set up my tent slowly, hammering the stakes into the ground with a rock I found nearby. The tent fabric shook lightly as the breeze hit it. When I finished, I placed my sleeping bag inside, arranged my things neatly, and sat down outside on a fallen log. I took out a small snack and ate it while looking through the trees. The sun was starting to drop behind the branches, turning everything orange and soft. That was when I first noticed something unusual. It was faint, almost nothing, something easy to ignore, but I caught it because of how still everything else was. It was a small noise, like a branch being pushed aside. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp and out of place compared to all the normal forest sounds. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or something small. I looked in the direction it came from but saw nothing but trees and shadows. I waited, listening for more, but the forest went silent again. It bothered me for only a moment before I convinced myself it was normal. As the light faded, I set up my small stove, boiled water, and made a simple meal. The smell of warm food mixed with the cold forest air made me feel calm. I ate slowly, thinking about nothing important, just enjoying the quiet. When I finished, I cleaned everything and put the trash in my bag to carry out later. I didn't want to leave anything behind. Night settled in fast, faster than I expected. The darkness in the forest felt heavier somehow. When I turned on my flashlight, the beam looked thin, like the night was swallowing most of it. The trees around me became dark silhouettes that felt taller and closer than before. I sat inside my tent, zipped it up, and lay on my back, listening to the distant sounds of insects and leaves shifting in the wind. But after about an hour, the wind stopped. It became so quiet that I could hear the faint ringing inside my ears, the kind that only comes when everything else is silent. I tried to sleep, but something kept me alert, something small and irritating, like my body sensed something before my mind did. Then I heard it again. A sound, this time a slow, steady movement through the bushes. It wasn't loud or rushed. It was the sound of something pushing aside dry leaves and snapping small twigs under its weight. It came from the direction where I had heard the earlier noise. I lay perfectly still, holding my breath, waiting to see if it continued. And it did. A few more steps, then silence again. My heart began beating fast, the kind of beating that shakes your chest. I tried to think of a logical explanation. An animal, maybe, a big one, but something about the steps felt too controlled, too slow, as if something was trying not to be noticed. Animals usually move in uneven patterns, quick or uncertain, but these steps had a steady rhythm. I turned off my flashlight and lay in the dark, thinking I would hear better without the light. That was a mistake. The darkness only made everything else feel stronger. I listened for what felt like forever, but nothing else moved. Eventually, my fear settled into exhaustion, and I drifted into a shallow sleep. When I woke up, it was still dark. For a few seconds, I couldn't tell where I was. My mind felt foggy. I pushed myself up slowly and heard something outside the tent. This time, it wasn't movement through bushes. It was breathing. Deep, steady breathing. My entire body froze. The breathing was slow and heavy, like someone standing right next to the tent. I felt a tight pressure in my chest as my thoughts spun out of control. My hand reached slowly toward the knife inside my bag, but I didn't unzip anything. I didn't even move my arm too much because I was scared the sound might draw attention. The breathing stayed there for several long seconds. It was so close I felt like I could picture someone standing there in the dark, just inches away from the thin fabric separating us. Then it stopped. Not gradually. It just ended like whoever or whatever was there suddenly held their breath or walked away without a sound. I waited, not moving at all, too afraid to even blink. Minutes passed, maybe more. After a long time, I finally forced myself to move. I slowly unzipped the tent window just enough to look outside. The forest was completely black except for the pale light of the moon coming through the branches. I saw nothing near the tent. No footprints, no shadow, nothing. But the fear didn't leave. It stayed with me the entire night, and I barely slept again. When the sky finally brightened, I stepped outside, feeling weak and tired. I looked around the campsite carefully. The ground was covered with leaves, but I noticed a small area where the leaves were pushed aside as if something had been standing there. The marks weren't clear, but they were enough to make my stomach twist. I knew animals could come close to tents, but the breathing I heard felt too controlled, too slow, too deliberate. Still, I tried to calm myself by assuming it was just my tired mind playing tricks. I made breakfast, but I barely tasted any of it. I kept looking around, scanning the trees. The area felt different in daylight, but not in a comforting way. Felt watched. Felt like something had changed during the night. Despite the uneasiness, I wasn't ready to pack up yet. I didn't want to leave so quickly and tell myself I ran away because of fear. I forced myself to spend the day exploring, but I stayed close to camp because something inside me kept telling me not to go too far. A few hours later, as I walked a bit deeper into the trees, I found something strange. It was a broken tree branch that looked like it was snapped recently, not fallen naturally. The break was clean, sharp, and at shoulder height, not at the ground. I touched it, feeling how fresh it was. It didn't feel like an animal caused it. It felt like someone grabbed it and broke it downward with force. That was when the fear hit me harder. I stood there for a long moment, listening, waiting to hear anything around me. The forest was quiet again. When I returned to my campsite, I tried to shake it off, but my mind kept replaying everything from the night. I forced myself to eat lunch and took a short rest, but sleep never came. My body felt too tense to relax. By late afternoon, the sky turned gray as if a storm was building far away. I checked my things and prepared for another night, although a part of me wished I could just teleport home. I didn't want to admit that I was scared, but everything inside me knew that I was more afraid than I had been in years. As evening came, I made a small fire to feel safer. The warmth helped, but the shadows created by the firelight made the forest look more alive. As I sat on the log again, I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see movement at any moment. At one point, I heard something faint far behind the trees. It sounded like something tapping wood, like a stick hitting a trunk. A single tap, then another, slow, spaced apart. I stared into the forest, my heart pounding as each tap echoed faintly. It didn't sound natural. It sounded like a signal, a deliberate action, but I couldn't explain how or why. The tapping stopped after a few minutes, and I didn't hear anything else after that. But my fear didn't go away. I sat there until the fire burned low, then finally crawled inside my tent again. I left the flashlight on this time because darkness felt too dangerous. Hours passed with no sound. I almost convinced myself that everything would be calm that night. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, the sound returned. Not breathing, not footsteps, something worse. It was the sound of my backpack zipper being pulled slowly. I felt the air leave my body. My heart started beating so fast I thought it might burst. I stayed completely still, too afraid to move. I listened as the zipper continued, inch by inch, like someone was trying to open it quietly. My backpack was right outside the tent door. Something or someone was right there touching it. I reached slowly for the knife inside my sleeping bag. My hand shook as I held it. I didn't know if I would use it. I didn't know what would happen next. The zipper stopped. Then I heard the soft sound of something being shifted around inside the bag. Items being moved. Things being touched gently, as if someone was searching through it. Not an animal. Animals rip, pull, claw, or drag. This was careful, human-like. The rummaging lasted a long time. Then everything went quiet. Too quiet. I felt sick as I lay there, gripping the knife, my breathing shallow and ragged. Couldn't peek out. Couldn't make a sound. I just stayed there, trapped inside thin fabric, hoping nothing worse would happen. Eventually, I heard slow steps walking away from the tent, brushing through the leaves, fading deeper into the forest. When the first weak light of dawn showed through the tent walls, I unzipped the door slowly and looked out. The forest looked normal, calm, peaceful. But the moment I saw my backpack lying open, everything inside me tightened. The food wrappers were moved around, but nothing was taken. My clothes were shifted. My water bottles were rolled slightly to the side. But the most disturbing part was that my spare flashlight was sitting on top of everything, placed neatly as if someone wanted me to see it. I packed everything as fast as my shaking hands allowed. I didn't eat. I didn't sit down. I didn't even try to think anymore. I shoved everything into the bag, took down the tent, and started walking back toward the direction I came from. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't look behind me, but something felt wrong again. The forest didn't feel familiar. The trees looked different. The path seemed off. I checked my compass, and it showed the right direction, but the surroundings didn't match what I remembered. I kept walking, hoping I just misread my memory, but after almost an hour, I realized something terrifying. Someone had placed stones along the path. Human-placed stones. Neat piles spaced evenly apart. They weren't there when I came in. They were fresh, clean, recently stacked. I walked faster. My chest tightened. My legs felt weak. My throat was dry. I didn't know who was out there or why they were messing with me. The tapping began again. Far away at first, then closer. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, patient, not rushing toward me, not chasing me, just following, just making itself known. I didn't run yet. I forced myself to walk faster, pushing through branches, stumbling over roots, scraping my arms on bark. My breath came out in harsh bursts, and sweat ran down my back even though the air was cold. I knew I wasn't alone in the forest. Someone had been near me all night. Someone had watched me breathe inside the tent. Someone had touched my things. The tapping grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I ran. My backpack slammed against my shoulders with each step. Branches whipped against my face and arms. Leaves crunched loudly under my boots as I sprinted through the forest with no control, just pure instinct. I didn't care about staying quiet. I didn't care about directions anymore. I only cared about getting away. The tapping turned into quick cracking sounds behind me, like someone was moving fast now, pushing through branches with purpose. I didn't look back. I was too afraid of what I might see. After what felt like forever, I saw sunlight hitting a familiar shape, the dirt clearing where my car was parked. My heart surged. I sprinted harder, feeling my legs burn, almost falling multiple times. When I reached my car, I threw my bag into the back seat, pulled the door shut, and locked everything instantly. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the keys twice before getting them into the ignition. The engine turned, the sound loud in the silent clearing. I stepped on the gas and drove forward fast, gravel flying behind the tires. As I turned the car onto the narrow dirt road, I looked once into the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone, but the forest edge felt alive. The trees looked darker. The shadows looked deeper. It felt like someone was standing just inside the tree line, watching me leave, hidden by the thick branches. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, and even then I kept going for miles, checking the mirror every few minutes. When I finally got home, I emptied my backpack on the floor. Everything was there, but the items were still rearranged strangely, like someone wanted to make it clear they had touched each one. My spare flashlight lay on top again. I didn't put it there. I threw it away, but that didn't help the feeling. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep properly. Every small noise woke me. Every dark corner made me feel watched. I kept replaying the breathing outside the tent, the slow zipper, the careful movement of items. Someone had been out there with me, but they didn't try to steal anything. They didn't attack me. They didn't speak. They just watched, followed, observed, and got as close as they wanted. The worst part is knowing how easy it was for them to reach me, how thin the tent wall was, how quietly they moved, how deliberate everything felt. The ending is clear to me now. I wasn't alone in that forest for even a single night. Someone had been there long before I arrived. Someone who knew the area well, perhaps better than anyone else. Someone who had probably watched other campers before me. Someone who didn't need to hurt me to control me. Someone who preferred the silence and the dark. And the only reason I made it out was because they chose to let me. I haven't gone camping since. I don't think I ever will again. I reached the campsite late in the afternoon after a long walk through the dense forest that spread across the northern side of the valley. The air felt heavy and still when I stepped out of the last tall bushes and saw the flat patch of dirt where I planned to spend the night. The place looked peaceful from far away, but as I walked toward it, the trees seemed to shift in how they framed the clearing, like they were leaning closer toward me. I blamed it on my tired eyes and the heat stuck inside my backpack straps. I dropped my pack and stood for a moment to catch my breath. My shirt clung to my back, sticky with sweat. I could taste the dust I had breathed in for the last 3 hours of walking. The forest around me was silent except for an occasional crack from somewhere deeper inside the tree line. One of those noises you hear only when you stand still long enough. It made me turn my head every few seconds, checking for movement even though I saw nothing. The clearing was about 15 meters wide. The dirt showed signs that other people had camped there before, maybe months or years earlier, because there were faint marks that looked like leftover fire pits and footprints smoothed out by rain. I walked along the edges to pick the best place to set my tent and tried to ignore the strange pressure in my chest that made me feel like someone was watching me from between the tall trees. The moisture in the air made the forest smell stronger than usual, like the mix of old wood, wet soil, and something else that I couldn't explain. When I finally unpacked my gear, the first thing I set up was the tent. I wanted it ready before the sun dropped behind the ridge. As I was securing the stakes in the dirt, I kept glancing up toward the tree line. I didn't hear anything unusual, but I felt a weird tightness under my ribs, the kind that grows slowly until it becomes a small knot you carry for the rest of the night. It wasn't fear yet, but it was something close. Once the tent was done, I collected some dry branches scattered along the ground. The air turned cooler with the sun drifting lower. When the breeze brushed my neck, it felt colder than it should have been, almost sharp. I kept telling myself that I was just tired, that long hikes always made me overly aware of my surroundings. After building a fire pit and getting the flames going, I sat down on a smooth rock near the edge of the clearing. The fire crackled, shooting sparks up toward the evening sky. As the light faded, the trees turned into tall, dark shapes with their tops bending slightly like they were following the direction of the wind. But the wind was not strong enough to move the trees like that. They swayed more gently, almost slowly, like they were breathing. I tried to ignore it and focused on eating the simple meal I packed. My hands were steady at first, but as I ate, I noticed how the forest behind the firelight kept looking darker with every passing minute. I didn't like how the shadows seemed thicker there than in other parts of the forest. The smell of the burning would mix with the scent of damp plants and dry leaves, creating a strange mix that made me feel uneasy. When full darkness finally settled, the only thing stopping the clearing from being swallowed completely was the fire in front of me. Its orange glow stretched only a few meters in each direction, leaving the rest of the area covered in deep black. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that everything around me was normal. After all, I had camped alone many times before, but this place felt different, and that feeling grew heavier each time I looked toward the trees. I started to hear small noises. At first they seemed normal, tiny snaps, faint rustling, the calls of distant insects. But then I realized something strange. Those sounds never came from random directions. They always came from the same general area, the dark corner between two thick trees on the far side of the clearing. It wasn't loud enough to make me jump, but it was persistent. A soft crunch, a slow drag, then silence again. I stared at that patch of darkness for long stretches of time without moving. I tried to look for the shape of an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but I saw nothing but thick shadows. When the fire died down a little, the sounds became more frequent. They were slow and cautious, almost like something was testing the edge of the clearing. I added more wood and watched the flames grow. When the clearing brightened again, the noises stopped. The silence felt too sudden, too controlled, and that made me more uneasy than the noises themselves. I knew that predators sometimes watched campsites at night. I kept reminding myself of that, repeating it in my head as I checked my backpack for the small knife I kept for emergencies. The blade was short and not good for serious defense, but holding it made me feel a little less exposed. Hours passed like that, with me staring into the forest and shifting my weight on the rock every few minutes to stop my legs from cramping. My eyes grew tired to the point where the edges of my vision blurred. At one point I blinked hard and rubbed my face with both hands. My skin felt cold despite the fire. When the fire burned to low embers again, the noises returned. They were closer this time. I could tell because I felt them more than I heard them, the faint vibration of something stepping lightly on packed soil. I held my breath without meaning to. The rustling grew louder and then stopped again. A few seconds later, something moved between the trees. It was not a clear shape at first. I saw only a slow shift in the darkness, like a shadow pulling away from other shadows. I leaned forward without thinking, squinting until my eyes stung. The shape stayed still for a long time, so long that I almost convinced myself it was just a trick of the firelight. But then it swayed. The movement was slow and deliberate, too controlled to be a deer and too upright to be anything on four legs. I felt a cold wave roll down my back. My hand tightened on the knife. I did not understand what I was looking at, but it was definitely not a normal wild animal. The way it stood, the way it leaned slightly forward, almost like it was trying to look at me without stepping into the light, it made something inside me curl up in instinctive fear. The figure stayed there for several minutes. I could barely breathe the whole time. The fire crackled softly, making the silence feel even sharper. Every small sound echoed in my chest. I watched the figure with every bit of focus I had, trying to make sense of it, but all I saw was a tall shape that almost blended into the darkness, but not quite. It felt like it knew exactly how much light touched the edge of the clearing and exactly where to stop so I could see it but not recognize it. My stomach tightened. My hands shook. The pressure behind my ribs grew so strong that I felt sick. I wanted to get up and run, but I knew how dangerous it was to run blindly into a forest at night. I forced myself to stay still even though every part of my body wanted to move. Eventually, the figure stepped back into the deeper darkness, disappearing completely. The moment it vanished, the night felt heavier. My heartbeat thumped painfully in my ears. I looked at the dying fire and then at the tree line, wondering how many hours until sunrise. I added more wood again, even though I didn't want to get close to the edge of the darkness. My arms felt weak when I leaned forward. I kept looking behind me and around me while gathering the branches, convinced that the figure would appear from any direction. As the fire rose again, I stayed close to it, trying to keep my back toward the tent so nothing could approach from behind without stepping into the light. I watched the flames until my eyes watered. Time moved painfully slow, like each minute stretched into 5. The noises did not return for a long while, but that didn't ease my mind. It made me more nervous, because silence meant the figure was either watching without moving or waiting for something. I never felt more alone in my life than in those hours when I couldn't hear anything except my own breathing and the crackling of the fire. At some point deep in the night, I started hearing new noises. These ones were softer, less cautious, like tiny taps on bark and faint scraping sounds. They came from several points around the clearing now, not just the original spot. It made me feel trapped even though nothing had entered the open space. My thoughts grew darker. I imagined the figure moving around the tree line, circling slowly, checking every angle. My chest burned with fear. I kept staring at the edges of the clearing until I could barely keep my eyes open. And then I saw it again. This time it stood in a different spot directly across from the first area. It looked closer, too. The firelight barely reached that far, but it was enough to catch the outline of something tall with narrow shoulders. It didn't look human in the way a normal person stands. It stood too still, too tense, like it held itself in a way that didn't match the natural posture of a person relaxed or even alert. It was something else entirely, something I didn't understand and didn't want to understand. I felt my legs shaking. I clenched my teeth to stop them from chattering. My fingers dug into the handle of the knife until my knuckles hurt. For the first time that night, my mind accepted that I wasn't imagining anything. Something was really out there watching me. The figure did not move for a very long time. The silence became unbearable. The air felt almost too thick to breathe. I kept staring, terrified that if I looked away for even 1 second, it would move closer. Eventually, slowly, it stepped backward again and vanished between the trees just like before. When it disappeared the second time, something changed inside me. The fear grew sharper, clearer, like it was no longer just instinct, it was understanding. Whatever was out there was not wandering by accident. It was planning something. The hours that followed felt endless. I didn't sleep. I didn't relax. I didn't even blink unless I had to. I watched the tree line until the fire burned low again. And each time the light faded, the noises came again. A slow crack of a branch. A faint scrape of something brushing against bark. A soft step. Then silence. Then another sound from a different direction. I felt surrounded even though I couldn't see anything clearly. My body stayed locked in a cold, tight tension that wouldn't go away. My muscles hurt. My throat felt dry. My mind kept racing through possibilities. Animals, people, hunters, or something else entirely. None of the explanations fit the way the figure moved or behaved. Hours later, the first hint of dawn finally appeared behind the trees. At first, it was only a dim gray light that made the forest shapes slightly softer. But it was enough for the noises to stop. As the sky brightened gradually, the pressure in my chest eased just a little. I felt the cold sweat drying on my skin. When the sun finally rose enough to light the clearing, I got up slowly, my legs stiff and unsteady. I scanned the entire tree line again and again, looking for any sign that something had been there. I saw nothing moving, but the forest still felt wrong, like the trees were holding something quiet between them. I packed up my gear as fast as my tired hands could move. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of that place before anything else happened. My throat felt tight the whole time. Every few seconds, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting the figure to appear again now that I could see clearly. When everything was packed, I took one last look around the clearing. The sunlight made the place look normal again, almost peaceful, but I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. That experience was burned deep inside me. As I walked away from the campsite, my legs felt weak, and the forest felt too quiet again. I kept picturing the tall shape standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at me without moving. I felt the tension in my shoulders grow every time the path curved and the trees closed around me. I walked for hours without stopping, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and that place. When I finally reached a wider path near the valley entrance, the sun was high in the sky. The air felt warmer. The sounds of birds replaced the strange silence of the night. But even then, I kept glancing back over my shoulder. I knew I wouldn't see anything behind me, but the feeling followed me all the way to my car and even as I drove away. The ending became clear only after I got home, when I thought about everything again in daylight. What scared me wasn't just the shape or the noises. What scared me was how patient it had been. It didn't rush. It didn't attack. It simply watched. It watched for hours without losing interest, as if it was measuring me, waiting for the right moment or the right weakness. And the truth is, if the sun had taken a little longer to rise, or if I had fallen asleep even for a few minutes, I really don't know what would have happened. I haven't camped alone since that night, and I don't think I ever will again, because I learned something very real in that clearing. The most dangerous things in the wild are the ones that don't rush toward you. They just stand there long enough for you to feel their patience. ***. And whatever stood in that tree line had too much patience.